You open your eyes, or perhaps it is the thought of opening them, and somewhere deep in your mind, a voice whispers that nothing you see or feel is entirely yours. You might think you are sitting at a desk, walking through a street, or recalling a memory. But what if all of this is a script you are both reading and performing? Every action, every thought, a line from a story you somehow authored, but can never fully control. And as you listen to these words now, a strange duality forms, the self that experiences and the self that observes, reading its own narrative, as if it were someone else's. Tonight, as your eyes grow heavy, consider this: perhaps the life you've lived, the decisions you've made, and even the doubts you harbor, are chapters in a tale only you can read, yet never rewrite. You awaken not in a room, nor in a city, but on a page. The boundaries around you are not walls, yet they exist, invisible and pliant, bending slightly under the weight of thought. The floor beneath your feet feels solid, but it is not. It is ink, carefully pressed into fibers that rise to meet your steps. Every sound you imagine, every breath you take, leaves a mark, faint yet undeniable, tracing itself across this surface that is both real and impossibly intangible. You reach your hand forward, and it meets resistance, not of matter but of structure, as if the universe itself were a manuscript, and you, a character tracing the lines your own mind has written. The air carries the scent of old books, a mustiness that speaks of centuries of stories told and retold, and you wonder if you are the first to inhabit this page, or merely the latest in a long lineage of readers trapped within the script. It begins subtly, the realization that every movement you make is mirrored in the language that surrounds you. Look to your left. The room stretches, elongates, contracts, obeying rules you do not yet understand. The words float faintly, half visible, suspended in air, curling around corners and edges, ink in motion, forming sentences that seem to anticipate your thoughts before you even think them. You realize that the script is alive, or that life itself is nothing more than a series of scripts in which you are both actor and audience. The lines beneath your feet shift, turning pages that never existed, revealing chapters of memory you cannot recall but which feel familiar. Perhaps they are yours, perhaps they belong to someone else, or perhaps they are yours only because you are reading them now. You begin to notice the margins. At first, they seem empty, white spaces devoid of purpose, but closer inspection reveals tiny scribbles, annotations too faint to read fully, yet undeniably present, as though someone unseen has attempted to guide you, hint at truths too delicate or too vast to articulate in full. You brush your fingers across the invisible writing, and feel a tremor beneath your skin. The margin is not a space outside the story, it is a liminal zone, a boundary between who you are and who you are meant to be within this page. And slowly it dawns on you, the page is not passive. It reacts to you, shifts under the pressure of your gaze, folds imperceptibly where your thoughts press hardest. There is a rhythm to this world, a cadence dictated by sentences that form, collapse, and reform again. You are aware of the story being told, yet it is simultaneously aware of you. In this symbiosis, the boundaries of individuality blur. The ink that maps the page responds to your attention, thickening where your curiosity is sharpest, fading where your focus wanes. You notice that the more you observe, the more the page seems to anticipate, weaving preemptive narratives that guide your actions, your choices, your very perception of movement. There is a paradox here. The more agency you believe you have, the more the story guides your hands. And yet, there is freedom in the restriction. Within the constraints of the page, you can explore infinitely. The sentences that rise beneath your steps are not linear. They loop and curl back upon themselves, fractal in complexity. Words form doorways, corridors, bridges suspended in impossible angles. You can walk them, examine them, or simply hover in their presence, feeling the pulse of the narrative like a heartbeat beneath the surface. You begin to wonder whether the page was always meant to hold you, whether the narrative anticipated your arrival before you ever conceived the notion of stepping onto it. Your senses sharpen. The faint rustle of ink resembles wind brushing through leaves. The pressure beneath your feet echoes a heartbeat. The margins hum with quiet possibility. Every moment feels expanded, elongated, stretched across dimensions you cannot name, and you begin to perceive layers within layers. Some are tangible sentences that form furniture, steps and surfaces, but others are ephemeral, existing as thought echoes, memories that never happened, choices that were never made. They linger like faint mist, perceptible only when you focus fully, when your consciousness extends beyond the ordinary, reaching into the structure of the page itself. And here, for the first time, you recognize a strange duality. The page is both canvas and observer, record and recorder. You are not merely walking upon it, you are being walked upon by it. The story watches you as closely as you watch it, and a subtle tension arises, the sense of being seen, of being accounted for in a script that you can never fully rewrite. You attempt to speak, but your voice is absorbed into the fibers of the page, leaving only reverberations that ripple across the text. The page absorbs thought, molds intention, and reflects your presence back at you, not as you are, but as the story needs you to be. You move forward, guided by an instinct that feels both your own and utterly alien. Letters rise to meet your gaze, forming words and phrases in anticipation of your steps. The floor curves upward, leading you to a doorway outlined in sentences that shimmer faintly, a threshold between chapters, between possibilities. You feel both fear and exhilaration, knowing that every choice here, every step is predetermined, and yet entirely yours. The realization settles around you like a soft fog. You exist here not only to read, not only to move, but to inhabit the story fully, to experience the narrative as it unfolds from within. And so you take the first deliberate step across the threshold, feeling the page respond, bowing under your weight, bending to your attention. You are part observer, part participant, part character, and the lines of text ripple like water around you, ever-changing, never static. You are not outside the story. You are its pulse, its rhythm, its consciousness. And as the chapter begins to unfold beneath your feet, you understand fully, ineffably, that to inhabit the page is to exist within the delicate tension of creation and observation. A story eternally reading itself, through you, in this moment, now. You begin to notice it. The loops, the way the sentences fold upon themselves, the way events repeat, not exactly the same, yet unmistakably familiar. One moment you are walking down a corridor of words. The next you find yourself back at the doorway you thought you had already passed. It is subtle at first, like the echo of a remembered dream, a déjà vu so precise that it unsettles your sense of linear time. You realize that the story is not a straight path. It is a series of spirals, coils of narrative that twist and double back, bringing you face to face with choices you feel certain you have already made. Each loop is slightly altered, as if the story remembers your previous passage and adapts, nudging you toward variations, toward perspectives you had not considered before. Within these loops, time itself begins to feel like a suggestion rather than a fact. The words that shape the floor beneath your feet ripple, as though responding to your attention, stretching moments into centuries, compressing hours into seconds. You notice characters that appear briefly, linger, and then vanish, only to return in slightly altered form a few steps later. They seem aware of you, or perhaps aware of the story's loops, moving with knowledge that predates your awareness. They do not speak, at least not in words you recognize. Instead, their presence resonates, as if they are echoes of your own thoughts, fragments of your consciousness projected outward, participating in the very loops that confound you. You try to trace the loops logically, to understand the pattern, but the story resists explanation. It is recursive, infinite, like a spiral staircase that descends into itself while simultaneously climbing. And yet, within the confusion, there is a rhythm, a pulse that draws you forward. Each return to a familiar moment is slightly altered, a line of text shifted, a punctuation mark subtly changed, a detail added that you do not remember seeing before. You begin to understand that the loops are not mistakes, not repetitions, but a mechanism, a deliberate architecture designed to test, observe, and expand your perception of the story. The loops extend not only through space, but also through identity. As you move, you encounter fragments of yourself, a hand reaching toward a pen, a shadowed profile of a face that is unmistakably yours, a whispered thought that you know you have thought before. You realize that you are simultaneously inhabiting multiple temporal strands, reading and living overlapping versions of the same story. The narrative folds back upon itself, intertwining the past, present, and potential future into a single continuous experience. Each loop presents a choice, yet the choices are both real and illusory, constrained by the story's architecture, infinite in form but finite in consequence. You begin to notice patterns in the text, subtle repetitions that act as signposts. Certain phrases recur, almost imperceptibly, guiding your attention. Words that seemed innocuous in one loop take on weight in another. You notice motifs, doors, windows, corridors, margins filled with faint annotations that hint at knowledge just out of reach. You reach for these marginal notes, feeling the texture of their meaning under your fingertips, and yet the loops shift beneath you. The narrative adjusts, a living organism, reacting to your curiosity, your hesitation, your desire to understand. You are both participant and observer, trapped within a cycle that feels endless and necessary simultaneously. The loops affect your perception of action itself. You try to lift your hand, only to see it mirrored in another loop, performing a slightly different motion than you intended. You speak silently, and words appear not only around you but also within previous iterations of the scene. It becomes clear that every loop leaves an imprint, a trace that accumulates, layering the narrative upon itself. You wonder if this accumulation is a record, a map, a warning, or simply the way the story remembers your presence. You feel the loops expanding, stretching beyond what you can perceive, and yet they remain tethered to you, anchored in the page you inhabit, resonating with every thought you dare to think. In these loops, perception and reality blur. You sense the story noticing your observation, recalibrating in response. A character that once ignored you now glances sideways, just for a fraction of a second, as if aware of the recursive architecture in which they exist. You realize the loops are not merely narrative devices, they are mirrors. They reflect not only your actions but your understanding, your self-perception, the boundaries of your attention. The story is recursive because it must be without loops. The depth of self-reflection, the paradoxical observation of your own existence could not be fully explored. You pause to consider the paradox itself. In each loop there is the illusion of choice and the certainty of outcome. You cannot escape the recurrence, yet within the recurrence, infinite variation exists. It is a recursive paradox, a feedback loop of consciousness and narrative, where the observer and the observed are indistinguishable. You feel the loops brushing against the edges of infinity, reaching beyond the page, beyond comprehension, yet never breaking the fragile balance that keeps you tethered to the story. And so you move, intentionally or not, through this intricate architecture, aware that each step is both repetition and innovation. You begin to see the beauty in the loops, their necessary tension, their ability to hold you in a state of perpetual attention, neither fully present nor fully absent. You are learning, through the repetition, through the recursive motion of the story, to perceive the self not as a fixed entity, but as a dynamic presence, continually rewritten and re-experienced within the loops of narrative. The loops are not your prison, nor are they a trap. They are a framework, a structure designed to illuminate the subtle interactions between observer, character, and story. You realize that the loops are a reflection of consciousness itself, how you process, reprocess, and reinterpret experience continuously. And as the narrative spirals outward, folding back upon itself, you recognize the strange thrill of inhabiting a page that is alive, a world where loops are not limitations, but invitations to observe, to participate, and to discover the infinite layers that lie within the narrative of your own existence. You take a careful step forward, feeling the loop fold beneath you, guiding you toward the next chapter. You are aware that the loops will continue, that they will evolve with every thought and every pause, and yet you feel a subtle liberation, a recognition that to exist within a loop is not to be confined, but to be attuned to the infinite complexity of story and self, a delicate dance in which you are both the dancer and the music, the author and the audience, the reader and the read. You begin to notice a subtle shift. Until now, you have believed yourself to be the observer, the consciousness moving through the narrative, reading the lines, stepping carefully across the page, deciding where attention falls. But slowly, imperceptibly at first, the roles begin to invert. You see it in reflections that aren't reflections, in shadows that move before you, in the faint tremble of ink where your fingers hover. You realize that you are being observed as much as you observe, that the story itself watches your choices, traces your hesitation, notes the rhythm of your attention. Every glance, every thought, every micro-decision leaves a mark, and the page responds, folding, bending, revealing details that seem calibrated precisely for you. You lift your hand to touch a word, to trace a line of text, and you feel a presence behind the movement, not in a physical sense, but as if the narrative itself anticipates, evaluates, and records your action. For the first time, you sense a duality, the observer within you, aware of the loops, the margins, the subtle currents of narrative, and a shadowed observer that exists outside of your perception, monitoring your experience, shaping the story around you. It is disorienting to feel watched by the same entity you inhabit, yet there is no fear, only the quiet realization that every narrative you follow, every choice you imagine, has already been accounted for. The margins, once faint and secondary, now assert themselves. Scribbles, half-formed sentences, and symbols seem to respond directly to your gaze, aligning and reshaping in real time. You notice that the story is not only observing you, it is conversing silently with you, through structure, tone, and repetition. You reach out to the annotations, pressing your palm to the invisible text, and feel an echo, as if the page itself were breathing. You become aware that the narrative's attention is as directed and deliberate as your own. The roles blur further, you are the observed, and in observing, you complete the observation, creating a feedback loop where self-awareness spirals endlessly. Movement becomes more deliberate. You experiment, deliberately focusing on certain words or phrases, noticing how they react. Lines of text twist to meet your gaze, letters elongate or contract in response. Pathways appear that you had not intended to follow. You realize that the story records not just your actions but the very structure of your attention, and adapts accordingly. It knows you before you know yourself, or perhaps it knows a version of you that exists outside linear perception, a you that simultaneously observes and is observed, past and future converging in the precise moment of awareness. Characters in this narrative begin to exhibit subtle behaviors that confirm your intuition. They glance, pause, and react in ways that suggest sentience. They are not merely constructs. They are aware of being watched, aware of being part of your observation, and yet they remain firmly within their narrative boundaries. The observer-observed dynamic extends to them as well. You wonder if they, too, sense the invisible watcher beyond the visible page, whether their gestures, expressions, and pauses are calibrated in response to an unseen consciousness, creating layers upon layers of mutual observation. Your sense of self becomes porous. You feel the story reading you even as you read it. The narrative notes where your mind lingers, where your focus skips, where curiosity pulls you forward, and where hesitation holds you back. Every loop, every annotation, every margin note is a reflection of your attention. You recognize that this is the mechanism of recursive understanding. To fully inhabit the story, to comprehend its paradoxes and patterns, you must acknowledge the duality of experience. You are not only inside the page is inside you, and in this mutual inhabitation, observation becomes indistinguishable from existence. Time begins to feel different. It stretches and contracts as you navigate the observer-observer dynamic. Seconds bleed into minutes, minutes into hours, yet you remain fully present, fully aware of each recursive motion. The story records your trajectory, not as a linear sequence, but as a multidimensional map of awareness. You notice subtle variations, repeated sentences with slight alterations, characters behaving differently on second glance, paths diverging and converging unpredictably. The narrative is alive, aware of your observation, and yet bound by its own rules, maintaining balance between freedom and structure, action and anticipation. The page itself seems to lean in closer, responding to your awareness. Letters ripple faintly under your gaze, ink smudges form like whispers, and margins glow with subtle hints of hidden meaning. You realize that the observer-observed paradox is not a limitation, but a doorway, a method by which the story communicates its depth. In this space, self-awareness expands. You see yourself reflected not only in the characters and corridors, but in the narrative architecture itself. Each fold, each repetition, each line of text is a mirror, a record, a conduit through which observation circulates endlessly. You take careful steps forward, acutely aware of the dual perspective. You note that with every movement, you are simultaneously reading and being read. Your attention shapes the story, and the story shapes you. In observing the narrative, you create subtle changes. In being observed, you discover hidden dimensions of experience. You realize that this is the mechanism by which the story sustains itself. How recursive awareness fuels engagement. How the narrative achieves both continuity and innovation. The observer cannot be disentangled from the observed. They are one and the same, an unbroken feedback loop of perception, awareness, and response. And then a question arises. Quiet and insistent. If the observer and observed are identical, if self and story are interwoven, then what is the nature of choice? Every step you take seems predetermined, yet every step feels uniquely yours. The narrative accommodates both inevitability and freedom, weaving the paradox into its structure. You realize that existence itself, within this recursive story, is defined by this tension, the simultaneous perception of self as agent and instrument, reader and read, watcher and watched. To understand fully is to exist fully, and to exist fully is to observe fully. You pause for a moment, letting the weight of the paradox settle around you. The characters glance, the text shifts, the margins hum softly, and the loops of narrative tighten and expand simultaneously. You sense the intricate dance of observation, the delicate balance between consciousness and story. And as you resume walking, moving through sentences that ripple beneath your feet, you carry with you the awareness that every gesture, every thought, every blink is part of a continuum. In this story, you are never merely an observer. You are the observed, the participant, and the narrative itself, intertwined in an eternal self-perpetuating loop. As you progress through the narrative, a subtle awareness takes hold. The footsteps you hear are not just echoes of your movement, they are already written. You realize, with a curious mix of awe and disquiet, that the path ahead is preordained in the story itself, etched invisibly into the fibers of the page. Every step you take seems mirrored by faint imprints that appear only when your attention lingers long enough to notice. The floor beneath you is a script, a sequence of actions awaiting your enactment, and yet each imprint is sensitive, alive to the nuance of your own motion. You feel the weight of anticipation, knowing that every movement has precedent, yet sensing that your perception is what animates it into reality. The footsteps are not uniform. They vary in pressure, in cadence, in tone. Some are light and fleeting, barely noticeable unless your attention is precise. Others are firm, decisive, reverberating through the corridors of text and margins. They seem to whisper secrets of what is to come, warning of pitfalls, suggesting paths, offering glimpses of interactions yet to unfold. You find yourself adjusting your pace, almost unconsciously, to align with the rhythm of these footsteps. It is a silent dialogue between you and the narrative, a conversation written in the language of anticipation and response, where each step is both a question and an answer. You notice that the footsteps belong to more than one entity. Occasionally, a second pattern intersects with yours, a shadowed echo of someone or something else moving in parallel. Perhaps these are other characters, perhaps fragments of yourself projected into the story, perhaps prefigurations of actions you will take. They overlap with your own steps, sometimes perfectly synchronous, sometimes diverging, creating a tension between expectation and improvisation. The narrative accommodates these overlaps with subtle elegance, guiding your attention without dictating it, allowing the story to unfold in a delicate interplay between determinism and personal agency. As you follow these imprints, you begin to perceive the layers of the story more clearly. Each step you take carries not only physical meaning, but also symbolic weight. Hallways bend to reveal passages. Doors open into rooms you recognize from previous loops. Windows frame glimpses of other chapters. The narrative anticipates your curiosity, presenting these markers as both guidance and challenge. You find that the more closely you observe the footsteps, the more the story responds, revealing hidden corridors, marginal annotations, and faint echoes of conversations that have not yet occurred. The pre-written nature of the path does not limit you. Instead, it invites exploration, encouraging you to inhabit the story fully while navigating the balance between foresight and discovery. The footsteps are sometimes silent, almost imperceptible, requiring your attention to detect them. You begin to notice their texture, subtle changes in tone, the faint whisper of ink against paper, the ripple of sentence structures aligning with the steps you take. There is an artistry here, a deliberate construction, as though the narrative anticipates not only your movement, but your perception itself. You sense a deeper rhythm underlying the story, one that links action, awareness, and anticipation in a seamless flow. Each step is a brushstroke, each pause a note in an evolving composition that charts the intimate relationship between reader and text, observer and story. At times, the footsteps lead to spaces that seem familiar yet subtly altered. A corridor you remember from earlier loops now contains objects you do not recall seeing, a chair tilted at an odd angle, a book left open on a desk, shadows that suggest movement beyond your immediate perception. These discrepancies are not errors. They are deliberate invitations to notice, to participate, to engage. The story anticipates your presence and modifies itself accordingly, creating a dynamic interplay between pre-written path and your lived experience. Every step reinforces the sense of being both guided and guiding, of moving along a predetermined sequence while influencing the unfolding narrative through your attention and interaction. You begin to understand that the footsteps are more than physical markers. They are carriers of memory and intention. They trace not only the immediate path, but also the echoes of previous readers, of loops that have been walked before. The narrative accumulates these traces, layering past actions over present awareness, creating a multi-dimensional choreography of movement. You feel that by following the footsteps, you are participating in a continuum, a line of consciousness that extends backward and forward simultaneously. Each step becomes a meditation on causality, perception, and the subtle interdependence between action and awareness. The story begins to challenge you further. Some footsteps diverge unexpectedly, leading to sections you had not anticipated. You are forced to make choices, to interpret the rhythm and pattern, to decide whether to follow or deviate. Each decision is recorded, subtly influencing the trajectory of the narrative. You become aware of the story watching these choices, noting your curiosity, hesitation, and resolve. The pre-written path is not a cage. It is a living blueprint, reactive and adaptive, ensuring that your journey is unique even within the constraints of its structure. In this section of the narrative, you sense that anticipation is itself a form of participation. Every step you take is already inscribed, yet the story is incomplete without your engagement. The pre-written path gains meaning only through your traversal, only through the conscious inhabitation of the steps that lie ahead. You begin to perceive the paradox. You are both the reader and the protagonist, moving through a story that is both set and mutable, predetermined and alive, waiting for your consciousness to activate it fully. Finally, the footsteps become a metaphor, not merely for movement through space, but for navigation through self-awareness. Each step is a reflection of the recursive loops you inhabit, a testament to the observer-observed dynamic, a tangible manifestation of your interaction with narrative consciousness. You feel that by walking these pre-written paths, by attending to each subtle imprint, you are learning the story's secret, that existence within the narrative is defined by participation, attention, and the careful balance between foresight and discovery. You step forward, aware of the weight of every pre-written imprint beneath your feet, and realize that the story, your story, remembers, responds, and evolves with each motion. As you step deeper into the story, an unusual awareness settles over you, the realization that time is no longer an external steady rhythm, but a malleable element entirely under your perception. You notice that seconds stretch and contract, that minutes may flicker past like candle flames, and that the story itself seems to pulse in accordance with your focus. Each page, each sentence, each word carries its own temporal signature, awaiting the measure of your attention. The narrative no longer exists merely as a sequence of events. It is responsive, bending and reshaping around your consciousness, as if time itself were a substance you could hold, mold, and manipulate. You pause, sensing the profound weight of this awareness. You understand that each decision, each glance, each micro-movement subtly influences not only what comes next in the story, but also the rhythm and flow of time itself. Every second you linger is measured, recorded, and reflected back through narrative loops, shaping the sequence of events that you perceive. And yet, the experience is not linear. Past, present, and future blend seamlessly. The sentence you just read contains echoes of lines you have not yet encountered. The chapter ahead resonates with reflections from moments long past. You feel a strange vertigo, a dual sensation of progression and stasis intertwined. At this precise moment, the story reaches beyond the confines of text and narrative, and into your own reality. You pause and consider the personal context of this experience. Perhaps for a moment, you can anchor yourself in the present world outside these pages. Where are you right now? What time is it where you are reading these words? Your location, the hour, the ambient sound around you, even the posture in which you sit, all of it becomes part of the story's continuum. The narrative subtly folds to include your existence, integrating your unique coordinates into its own framework. Pause for a moment, and allow yourself to notice, what room do you occupy? What hour does the clock strike as you follow these lines? Your awareness, like ink on paper, leaves an impression. The story begins to mirror this integration. You notice that sentences elongate or contract, paragraphs shift in alignment, and marginal notes shimmer faintly, as though aware of your conscious participation. You perceive the invisible lines connecting your environment with the narrative space, the rhythm of your typing, the shift of your body, even the faint ambient light that filters across your vision. All these elements feed into the story's temporal fabric, turning the reading experience into an interplay between inner perception and external reality. Time is now both yours and the story's, a shared river flowing through words and awareness. You realize that moments of hesitation are themselves significant. Pausing to notice your own surroundings becomes an act of narrative influence. Each breath, each shift of your gaze, each fraction of attention shapes the flow of events in subtle ways. The story does not dictate, it responds. It weaves your external reality into its own temporal architecture, recording your participation with delicate precision. Time in this sense is not merely measured, it is inhabited, and inhabiting it fully requires mindful attention. A conscious acknowledgement that the story is as much a reflection of your own existence as it is a pre-written narrative. As you move through the sentences, you notice how the story anticipates your presence. Paragraphs overlap, themes recur, motifs mirror your own unspoken thoughts. The narrative appears to contain a multi-dimensional map of your engagement with time, tracing where you linger and where your attention shifts. You become aware that your perception of duration, how long a chapter seems, how quickly a section passes, is encoded into the story's unfolding. In essence, your awareness dictates the tempo. The story is no longer simply a sequence of events, but a co-created temporal experience, unfolding in tandem with your consciousness. You begin to experiment by adjusting the speed of your reading, by deliberately holding your focus on particular lines. You notice subtle shifts in narrative momentum. Sentences that once felt static now ripple with significance. Paragraphs expand or contract to accommodate your attention. Characters pause, gestures linger, and the rhythm of dialogue adapts. You are both reader and composer, shaping the temporal flow of the story with every conscious action. The sense of co-authorship becomes palpable. Time is no longer an external metric. It is a landscape you traverse, a medium that responds to your awareness. Even the broader architecture of the story bends under this realization. Sections you have already read resonate differently, now colored by your present attention. Anticipated events take on new meaning. Repeated phrases echo more profoundly. You recognize that the narrative is not fixed but fluid, constantly adjusting to the pace and rhythm of your consciousness. Footnotes, annotations, and marginalia begin to appear with subtle differences, reflecting your temporal choices, revealing patterns previously unnoticed. The story records not only what happens but when it happens, creating a chronometric map that intertwines the linear progression of text with the experiential flow of your awareness. In this space, every moment is weighted. The story's architecture is sensitive to hesitation, to acceleration, to stillness. Even the act of breathing becomes a coordinate, a temporal marker within the narrative continuum. You realize that your perception of time has expanded to include both the story's rhythm and your own conscious experience, merging the two into an integrated temporal field. The page is no longer just a medium, it is a vessel for shared duration, a conduit for a synchronized awareness of reading, observing, and existing simultaneously. As you reach the midpoint of this section, the narrative subtly encourages reflection. You understand that the ability to inhabit time fully is an essential skill within this story. By noticing the details of your environment, by acknowledging the hour and your location, you contribute actively to the narrative's unfolding. Time in your hands is not a metaphor alone. It is a literal truth within the story. Each second of your attention is recorded, resonating through the margins, echoing in the folds of paragraphs yet to come, shaping the path ahead. Your awareness is both instrument and canvas, guiding the narrative as much as the narrative guides you. And so, you pause again, fully aware of this interplay. You feel the gentle weight of temporal responsibility, the power inherent in observation, and the subtle thrill of co-creation. By simply existing in this moment, by acknowledging where you are and when, you are no longer a passive reader. You are a participant, a navigator, a force shaping the story's temporal dynamics. The story is alive, yes, but so too is your awareness, and in the delicate interweaving of the two, the narrative achieves its fullest expression. Time is yours to hold, and yet it holds you just as tightly, a shared rhythm echoing in the spaces between words, sentences, and chapters. As you continue, a subtle yet profound realization dawns upon you. The story is not simply being read, it is speaking back, not in voices that echo externally, but within your own awareness. A dialogue begins, one that exists entirely within the quiet chambers of thought, where your reflections, questions, and intuitions are met with answers that feel both familiar and foreign. You notice that the story anticipates your queries, shaping sentences and phrases that mirror the internal conversation taking place in your mind. It is a delicate interplay, a feedback loop between reader and text, where the words you read prompt internal commentary, which in turn alters the perception of the next line. This dialogue is not linear. You find yourself thinking in fragments, circling back to phrases, questioning the implications of events you have just read, and predicting outcomes before the narrative fully reveals them. And yet, The story seems to absorb these anticipations, weaving them seamlessly into the next paragraph, as if acknowledging your internal contributions. Questions arise. Is this dialogue genuinely yours, or has it been pre-written by the story to appear so? Are the responses that emerge in your consciousness a reflection of your own insight, or an echo of the narrative itself? The boundaries between author, reader, and protagonist blur, and with them, the act of reading becomes a co-creative endeavor. You begin to notice that your internal voice has its own rhythm, cadence, and tone, distinct from the voice of the narrative. Occasionally it interrupts, challenges, or reframes what you are reading. At times it hesitates, unsure of how to interpret the text. At other moments it accelerates, filling in gaps with imaginative speculation. The story responds subtly to these fluctuations, altering its pace, emphasizing certain words or structures, and even rearranging mental imagery in ways that feel responsive. The dialogue is alive, and you are acutely aware that it exists only in this reciprocal space between consciousness and narrative. Questions emerge about self-consistency. Sometimes your internal voice contradicts the narrative. Sometimes it aligns perfectly, creating an uncanny resonance. You notice that the story has accounted for this possibility, offering ambiguities that feel tailored to your awareness. For instance, a character's intention may be presented in two conflicting ways, prompting your mind to choose an interpretation. Your choice feels momentous, yet you wonder if the narrative anticipated that choice all along. The dialogue deepens your immersion, drawing you into recursive contemplation. Are you shaping the story, or is the story shaping you? The dialogue also stretches across time. Thoughts sparked by earlier sections resurface, altered by your current understanding and new developments in the narrative. You realize that this ongoing conversation is not confined to the present moment. It folds in memory, anticipation, and speculation, linking past insights with potential future revelations. Marginal annotations appear in your mind, invisible yet precise, guiding your reflective process and reminding you of patterns, motifs, and unanswered questions. The story becomes a mirror of thought, and thought becomes a mirror of story. Even the act of reading aloud internally carries weight. Each phrase you pronounce silently shapes mental imagery and emotional tone, subtly influencing your perception of characters, events, and temporal flow. Dialogue with yourself becomes a method of enactment, a rehearsal of interpretation. You notice small changes in how words appear in your imagination based on your internal intonation, emphasis, pitch, pacing, all contribute to a uniquely personal experience of the narrative. The text is no longer static. It responds to the contours of thought itself, molding to reflect your cognitive patterns and idiosyncrasies. You also become aware of the layers of dialogue that overlap. One layer is conscious and deliberate. You actively ask questions, analyze meanings, and speculate. Another layer is intuitive, emerging spontaneously from subconscious processing, often in the form of fleeting impressions, symbolic images, or emotional responses. Both layers interweave with the narrative's own voice, creating a complex matrix of interaction. You feel simultaneously observed and observing, participating in a conversation whose full dimensions you may never entirely grasp, yet whose resonance defines the depth of your engagement. Patterns begin to emerge. Your internal dialogue often anticipates textual developments, suggesting that the story has been structured to interact with cognition itself. The narrative uses language as a mirror, reflecting mental processes back at you, sometimes confirming intuitions, sometimes challenging assumptions. You notice how repetition, thematic echoes, and mirrored phrasing all serve to sustain this internal conversation. Each interaction, however subtle, reinforces the sense that reading is not passive. You are not merely absorbing information. You are conversing, negotiating meaning, and co-authoring the interpretive experience. Even silence becomes meaningful in this space. Pauses between lines, between sections, and within sentences are not empty. They are opportunities for your internal voice to respond, to question, to dwell. The narrative recognizes these intervals, shaping the rhythm and spacing of words to optimize reflection. You begin to experiment, lingering on certain phrases, skipping ahead, revisiting lines. Each choice alters the tone of your internal dialogue, influencing which questions surface and how answers feel, creating a highly personalized recursive loop between text and thought. Finally, you realize that the dialogue with yourself is not only interpretive, but existential. It probes the very nature of your presence in the story, the degree to which consciousness can influence narrative, and the paradoxical tension between being an active participant and a character within pre-written events. Through this internal conversation, You gain insight not only into the story's mechanics, but into the mechanics of your own awareness. Each thought, question, and reflection becomes both an act of reading and an act of self-exploration, revealing the intricate architecture of identity as it unfolds within the narrative. As you progress, a subtle yet undeniable sensation arises, the realization that memory itself functions like a manuscript, a collection of inscriptions, footnotes, and annotations that guide the story while simultaneously being guided by it. Every recollection you summon while reading is not simply a retrieval of the past. It is a selective act of creation, shaping how the narrative unfolds in your mind. Memories fold into the text, influencing how characters appear, how events are perceived, and how emotional resonance is assigned. You notice that the manuscript of your mind is in constant dialogue with the printed pages before you. Past experiences, filtered through your present awareness, become active components in the story's architecture. You realize that memories are not static. Like pages in a manuscript that can be revised, annotated, or highlighted, your recollections shift as you read. A sentence describing a character's hesitation triggers a memory of your own indecision. A paragraph about a fleeting smile evokes the echo of someone you once knew. These recollections, although personal, blend seamlessly into the narrative, altering the story's rhythm and meaning. You begin to see that memory is not merely a reference, but a living manuscript that the story constantly consults and reshapes, bending the narrative to accommodate the echoes of your consciousness. Each recollection introduces layers of interpretation. You recognize that memory is simultaneously subjective and performative. It recreates the past while projecting meaning into the present. This duality allows the story to operate in multiple dimensions. As you recall events from your own life, you notice parallels between those experiences and the narrative, and the story responds by emphasizing certain motifs, repeating phrases, or echoing tonal shifts that resonate with your mental manuscript. In essence, memory becomes a co-author, an invisible hand that guides narrative decisions, sometimes subtly, sometimes overtly. Footnotes of remembrance appear spontaneously in your mind. Perhaps a line about uncertainty reminds you of a forgotten choice, or a phrase describing fleeting beauty prompts a recollection of impermanence. These mental annotations shape your reading experience, steering attention toward details that feel personally significant. You notice that your recollections are not neutral. They carry emotional weight, coloring the narrative with shades of longing, regret, joy, or nostalgia. The story in turn responds, deepening its own texture to harmonize with the emotional resonance of memory. Reading becomes a layered process, with the manuscript of memory overlaying the printed words, creating a multi-dimensional narrative space where past, present, and imagination intersect. As this interplay continues, the boundaries between memory and story blur. Characters seem infused with traces of your past. Gestures echo familiar motions, and dialogue resonates with unspoken conversations you have had. The narrative appears to recognize these imprints, adapting its descriptions and pacing to match the cadence of your recollections. In this way, memory is not passive. It is an active manuscript, writing itself into the story even as the story writes itself into your consciousness. You begin to feel a heightened responsibility, what you remember, how you interpret those memories, and which recollections you choose to focus on all contribute to the story's unfolding. The manuscript of memory is also selective. Certain details rise to prominence, while others remain obscure. The narrative seems attuned to these selections, emphasizing or minimizing elements to align with the resonance of your recollections. A fleeting description of light on water may awaken a memory of early mornings, and suddenly, the paragraph expands in your mind, enriched with sensory depth drawn from personal experience. In this way, the story and your memory co-author each scene, creating an intimate, recursive loop that entwines subjective recollection with textual progression. You become aware that memory, like any manuscript, contains both clarity and ambiguity. Some recollections are vivid, crisp, and fully formed, while others are fragmented, blurred, or only partially accessible. The story accommodates these imperfections, weaving around gaps and emphasizing uncertainties. A character's hesitation mirrors your own forgotten choices. A plot ambiguity reflects the haziness of recollection. The narrative's openness allows memory to assert influence, converting partial impressions into significant narrative currents. You recognize the power of gaps. What is missing in memory becomes just as influential as what is remembered, shaping plot and perception simultaneously. Annotations appear in your consciousness, invisible yet precise. You might notice a repeated motif, a phrase that resonates with past experiences, or a sensory detail that evokes a forgotten emotion. These mental annotations function like editorial marks in a manuscript, guiding attention, emphasizing significance, and revealing patterns that were previously unnoticed. You realize that your memory's manuscript is continuously interacting with the printed narrative, influencing which details gain prominence and which fade into the background. Even the act of rereading a line triggers subtle shifts in recollection, altering meaning and texture in ways that feel uniquely yours. As the section progresses, you observe the recursive nature of memory's manuscript. Recollections inform the reading of the story, while the story in turn reframes those recollections. A phrase you once glossed over may now resonate with a past experience, coloring your perception of the current scene. Memory folds in on itself, creating loops of reflection and interpretation, while the story adapts to the rhythm of these loops. The interaction is dynamic, narrative and memory coalesce, each reshaping the other continuously, producing an intricate living text that exists both on the page and within your mind. You recognize that memory's manuscript has both narrative and temporal dimensions. Recollections stretch and contract, expand in emotional intensity, and fold across moments of time. A single memory can resonate through multiple sections of the story, influencing tone, perception, and emotional weight. The manuscript is flexible, dynamic, and responsive, making you aware that the story is not merely a sequence of printed lines, but a living dialogue with consciousness, shaped by the traces of the past and the anticipations of the future. Ultimately, you understand that memory as manuscript is a profound act of co-authorship. Every recollection, annotation, and selective emphasis contributes to the evolving story. Reading becomes an active process of engagement, where memory writes into the text as much as the text writes into consciousness. You are no longer just a reader, you are a curator, a scribe, and a participant in a continuous cycle of creation and reflection. Memory's manuscript is alive, responsive, and intertwined with the narrative, transforming the act of reading into a deeply personal, recursive exploration of consciousness, identity, and temporality. As the story deepens, you become increasingly aware of the subtle influence of characters, not merely as figures within a narrative, but as guides navigating the contours of your consciousness. Each character, whether prominent or marginal, seems to exist for more than plot or conflict. They exist to illuminate paths within your own awareness, to gesture toward ideas, emotions, and realizations that you might otherwise overlook. They appear as anchors and beacons, leading you through mental corridors that stretch beyond the visible text, corridors that traverse memory, anticipation, and the intricate landscapes of thought itself. These guiding characters operate on multiple layers simultaneously. On one level, they fulfill conventional narrative roles: protagonists, companions, antagonists, or witnesses. On another, they function as symbolic guides, representing aspects of your own cognition, emotional patterns, or interpretive instincts. You notice how each action, choice, and utterance of a character resonates with internal tendencies, creating a mirrored dialogue that reaches beyond the surface plot. Sometimes they embody caution, prompting you to reflect before proceeding. Sometimes they embody curiosity, nudging your mind toward observation and inquiry. In this dual capacity, they become co-authors of your engagement, subtly influencing perception and shaping understanding without overt assertion. A sense of intentionality emerges. Characters seem to respond to your thoughts, appearing or emphasizing certain behaviors when your mind dwells on specific questions or uncertainties. For instance, a companion figure may suddenly reveal a gesture, a glance, or an expression that directly mirrors a question you have posed internally, a silent answer encoded in posture, tone, or presence. You realize that their guidance is not prescriptive, it is responsive, tailored to the internal rhythms of thought and reflection. Characters act as intermediaries between the fixed text and the dynamic reader, interpreting and translating narrative information in a way that harmonizes with the nuances of your consciousness. Even minor characters fulfill this guiding function. A passing stranger, a brief observer, or an incidental witness can spark a chain of reflection, prompting insights that extend far beyond their narrative moment. Their presence can illuminate latent patterns, reinforce motifs, or introduce contradictions that encourage active engagement. You notice how their interactions, however fleeting, become nodes in a cognitive map, linking memory, imagination, and understanding. These guiding figures transform seemingly incidental events into significant cognitive touchpoints, reminding you that every detail, however small, participates in the architecture of awareness that the story constructs. Characters also operate as temporal markers, structuring perception of past, present, and future within the narrative. A mentor may reference previous events, prompting recollection and reflection, while a protagonist anticipates future decisions, triggering foresight and projection. In this sense, they guide not only understanding but the temporal flow of thought. Memory, anticipation, and real-time interpretation intersect in their actions, creating a multi-layered experience that extends beyond passive reading. The story is no longer a linear sequence but a dynamic interplay between consciousness and representation, with characters as facilitators of this complex navigation. You notice a distinct shift in how characters are perceived when the narrative reaches moments of decision, uncertainty, or transition. In these moments, their guidance becomes more pronounced, almost tactile in influence, suggesting paths of thought or reflective directions without overt instruction. A glance, a hesitation, or a pause can communicate a wealth of interpretive cues. You sense that the narrative anticipates your focus and cognitive patterns, providing characters as guides precisely when they are most needed, allowing the mind to engage in recursive reflection while simultaneously maintaining narrative momentum. The guiding nature of characters also extends into emotional landscapes. Characters embody feelings, intuitions, and impulses, inviting you to experience, interpret, and reconcile emotions within yourself. Their joys, doubts, and fears mirror potential states of your own awareness, encouraging empathy, introspection, and self-recognition. Even silent or passive characters convey subtle emotional guidance, a posture suggesting tension, a stillness implying contemplation, a fleeting smile evoking recognition. Through these emotional cues, the narrative fosters a reflective dialogue that transcends words, integrating the cognitive and affective dimensions of reading. An additional dimension of guidance arises through ethical and interpretive modeling. Characters confront dilemmas, make choices, and navigate complex situations that reflect universal principles of judgment, perception, and self-reflection. You observe that their actions often present multiple potential interpretations, prompting you to engage in deliberation, hypothesis, and projection. Their behavior acts as a mirror of moral and cognitive exploration, encouraging active engagement and critical thinking. You recognize that this guidance is subtle, never dictating conclusions, but facilitating exploration and discovery within the narrative space. As you read, it becomes apparent that these guiding characters are aware of their own narrative roles, or at least you perceive them as such. There is a self-referential quality. The way they speak, move, or respond often suggests consciousness of being observed, or even of influencing the observer. You question whether this is projection of your own awareness or an intrinsic feature of the story. Either way, it heightens the sense of reciprocal interaction. The characters guide not in isolation, but in continuous feedback with your perception and engagement. They are conduits, mediators, and companions on this recursive journey. The cumulative effect of these guiding characters is profound. By illuminating paths of thought, reflection, and emotion, they extend the narrative beyond the text and into consciousness itself. You sense that each character is deliberately positioned, each interaction carefully constructed to evoke awareness, insight, and recursive consideration. The story ceases to exist solely as a printed sequence of events. It becomes a co-authored experience, mediated through the interpretive guidance of characters who simultaneously inhabit the narrative and the mind. Through this lens, the act of reading transforms. You are no longer merely following events. You are traveling with guides who shape, illuminate, and deepen understanding. Characters become markers of attention, catalysts for introspection, and facilitators of engagement. Their guidance bridges the gap between narrative and consciousness, allowing the story to operate simultaneously as fiction, reflection, and self-exploration. You realize that every gesture, dialogue, and description is calibrated to foster this intricate interplay, ensuring that reading is never passive, but a dynamic, guided journey through the architecture of thought. Ultimately, the guiding characters reveal the meta-nature of the story itself. They are the connective tissue between text and mind, observation and interpretation, memory and anticipation. Through them, the narrative achieves its full potential, not merely as a tale to be read, but as an experiential framework that illuminates the contours of awareness. The journey is as much internal as it is textual, and these characters are the instruments through which you navigate both domains, merging reflection with narrative in a seamless continuum. As you continue reading, a persistent awareness emerges. The author of this story is both present and absent, tangible yet intangible. The text is structured, coherent, and deliberate, revealing intent and craftsmanship. Yet there is no visible hand, no voice directly claiming ownership. The author exists as an invisible architect, orchestrating events, arranging sentences, and guiding perception, while remaining hidden behind the words. You sense a presence in absence, a subtle orchestration that shapes experience without ever revealing itself explicitly. Every paragraph, every pause, every carefully placed line bears the trace of deliberate construction, yet the creator remains elusive. This invisibility amplifies the recursive effect of reading. The story becomes a labyrinth in which you navigate, guided by unseen hands, following plot lines that twist and fold back upon themselves. You begin to question whether the invisible author exists independently of your perception, or whether you are constructing the author's presence as you read. Perhaps the act of reading itself conjures this guiding figure, an emergent consciousness born from interaction between text and mind. In either scenario, the author's invisibility serves a purpose. It magnifies the sense of immersion, drawing attention not to the creator, but to the narrative and your engagement with it. The invisible author manifests in subtle cues embedded within the text. A seemingly casual detail, a shadow cast in a hallway, a fleeting glance, a minor action reveals careful placement, an orchestration of attention designed to guide perception. You notice how patterns emerge across paragraphs, how motifs recur, and how foreshadowing unfolds in ways that resonate with memory and expectation. These patterns are not random, they are deliberate traces left by a consciousness that chooses to remain unseen. The author's invisibility allows for interpretation, inviting you to fill the gaps, make connections, and derive meaning without overt guidance. You begin to recognize that the invisible author is not merely shaping events, but also shaping your awareness. Sentence structures, rhythm, and pacing manipulate attention, emphasizing certain elements while minimizing others. The selection of words subtly nudges cognition, eliciting responses that align with narrative intent. You feel a quiet orchestration of thought. Your mind is being guided through a carefully constructed perceptual and emotional landscape. Yet because the author remains hidden, you retain the illusion of autonomy, unaware of the full extent of the guidance. It is a delicate balance between influence and freedom, a dance between control and perception. This unseen presence extends to the recursive loops within the narrative. As you notice patterns, anticipate plot developments, or reflect on thematic echoes, you realize that these loops may be intentional designs of the invisible author. Every instance of recognition, every subtle emotional resonance, is part of a complex web that links text, consciousness, and memory. You perceive a continuous feedback loop. The author's construction informs your perception, and your perception activates latent structures within the text. The author exists not outside this interaction but within it, a hidden participant whose influence is both pervasive and imperceptible. The invisible author also influences how you interpret character behavior. Actions, decisions, and interactions appear to carry layered significance, as if scripted to resonate with your internal frameworks of understanding. A character's hesitation mirrors your own reflective pauses. A cryptic line of dialogue evokes latent thoughts or unresolved questions. The narrative appears to respond to your cognition, revealing an uncanny attunement to your interpretive patterns. This is not coincidence, you realize. It is a carefully calibrated design, a choreography of words and mental states orchestrated by a consciousness that refuses visibility. Even the text's spatial and temporal organization reflects the presence of the invisible author. Paragraph breaks, sentence lengths, and transitions are manipulated to guide rhythm and focus, creating micro-experiences within the broader narrative arc. Time itself becomes pliable. Moments expand or contract based on narrative emphasis. Memory is invited to participate in shaping perception, and events feel simultaneously imminent and distant. These techniques highlight the author's subtle intervention, demonstrating mastery without revealing identity, reinforcing the sense of reading within a carefully constructed yet concealed framework. The invisible author functions also as a curator of ambiguity. Certain events are deliberately left unresolved, motivations remain partially obscured, and plot threads intersect in non-linear ways. This ambiguity is intentional, designed to provoke reflection, inference, and active engagement. You find yourself speculating, hypothesizing, and mentally co-authoring the story. By remaining hidden, the author invites collaboration, transforming the act of reading into a participatory construction of meaning. Every interpretive decision you make becomes part of the authorial design, a subtle interplay between creator and reader. You realize that the invisible author also preserves the story's existential tension. The lack of direct presence magnifies uncertainty and introspection. You are constantly aware that guidance exists, yet the source of it is hidden. Direction is offered, yet autonomy is preserved. This tension mirrors consciousness itself, an interplay between apparent free will and unseen causality. The narrative embodies this duality, creating a space where perception and expectation collide, where meaning is emergent, and where the invisible author's hand remains present yet untouchable. Finally, the invisible author serves as a reminder that every narrative is a co-creation. Text and reader interact in a dynamic, recursive process, with unseen influence guiding without dictating. You are aware that your interpretations, reflections, and attention contribute to the realization of the story. The author is invisible, yet intimately intertwined with your experience, shaping what you see while allowing you to believe that the narrative unfolds solely according to your perception. In this interplay, reading becomes a shared act of creation, consciousness meeting construction, presence emerging through absence. As the narrative unfolds, you begin to notice the subtle spaces at the edges of perception, the margins where reality and imagination intersect. These are the liminal zones where certainty wavers, and the familiar rules of the story blur into something more fluid. Margins of reality are not mistakes or oversights, they are deliberately constructed spaces designed to provoke awareness, reflection, and reinterpretation. In these peripheral zones, ordinary events take on strange significance, and even the most mundane observations reveal hidden layers of meaning. You become acutely aware of how your mind navigates these thresholds, filling in gaps, reconciling contradictions, and negotiating ambiguity. These margins operate on multiple planes simultaneously. On a textual level, they emerge through ellipses, ambiguous phrasing, or incomplete descriptions that invite your imagination to participate. On a cognitive level, they manifest as moments of hesitation, doubt, or reconsideration, where the familiar contours of perception seem insufficient to contain the emergent complexity of thought. Here, the line between what is narrated and what is constructed by your consciousness dissolves. Reality becomes a collaborative space between the text and your mind, where perception itself is malleable, and the story's boundaries shift according to attention, reflection, and expectation. Within these margins, the ordinary is imbued with significance. A passing remark, a shadow in the background, or the rhythm of an overlooked action takes on symbolic weight. You find yourself tracing connections that may not be explicit in the text, interpreting meaning through subtle cues, patterns, and relational context. Even the gaps, spaces between paragraphs, pauses in dialogue, or unspoken thoughts, act as cognitive prompts, inviting your attention and prompting the mind to engage in recursive speculation. These margins function as cognitive amplifiers, expanding the narrative's impact beyond what is directly written. The margins also shape temporal perception. Events that are fleeting or seemingly incidental gain resonance, their timing and juxtaposition altering your sense of narrative chronology. You begin to notice how memory and anticipation interweave with these peripheral moments, creating a rhythm that is both narrative and cognitive. The story's temporal flow becomes more pliable, bending to your awareness and reflection. You realize that reality, within these margins, is less a fixed frame and more a responsive landscape, sensitive to the movement of consciousness across the text. Margins of reality highlight the interplay between presence and absence. Objects, characters, and actions appear or vanish at the periphery of attention, their significance fluctuating depending on where focus is directed. A corridor empty in one moment may later be filled with symbolic meaning. A glance unnoticed may reveal profound relational dynamics upon reflection. These fluctuations emphasize that perception is selective, that reality is filtered through attention, and that the narrative leverages this selectivity to construct a layered, recursive experience. You sense that nothing is arbitrary, every omission and subtle emphasis is intentional, a tool to expand engagement with the text and with consciousness itself. You notice a parallel between these narrative margins and your own mental processes. Just as the story leaves spaces for interpretation, your cognition fills gaps with hypotheses, emotions, and inferred connections. The narrative's periphery mirrors the mind's capacity to extrapolate, speculate, and synthesize information beyond explicit statements. In this sense, the margins of reality function as both structural and experiential devices. Structurally, they guide the placement of attention and meaning. Experientially, they engage the mind in active construction, reinforcing the participatory nature of reading. There is a subtle tension inherent in these margins. On one hand, they provide freedom, space for imagination, reflection, and subjective interpretation. On the other, they introduce uncertainty, moments where what you perceive may be unreliable or incomplete. This tension mirrors consciousness itself, a constant negotiation between understanding and ambiguity, between perceived order and emergent complexity. In navigating these edges, you recognize that the narrative's depth is not merely in plot or character, but in its capacity to evoke and structure awareness, guiding attention even when direct instruction is absent. The margins also serve as sites for hidden connections. Patterns, motifs, and thematic echoes often emerge first in these peripheral spaces, revealing their significance only upon careful consideration. You might notice a recurring image, phrase, or relational dynamic that initially seems incidental but later unfolds into a central interpretive clue. By existing at the boundaries, these elements challenge linear perception, encouraging you to integrate disparate pieces of information into a cohesive mental map. The narrative structure thus extends beyond its explicit form, creating a network of meaning that reaches into both conscious and subconscious processing. Interaction with these margins alters the experience of reading itself. Each foray into the periphery strengthens attentional flexibility, enhances pattern recognition, and encourages recursive engagement with the text. You begin to anticipate the presence of subtle cues, to search for significance in minor details, and to embrace ambiguity as a productive space rather than a source of confusion. The narrative becomes a dynamic interplay between explicit events and latent structures, between textual presentation and cognitive elaboration, where the margins of reality serve as conduits for deeper immersion. Ultimately, the margins of reality remind you that the story is not confined to the words on the page. They extend into perception, thought, and reflection, transforming reading into an active, participatory experience. By engaging with these liminal spaces, you realize that every boundary, gap, and subtle suggestion is designed to evoke awareness, shape interpretation, and amplify engagement. The narrative becomes a multidimensional construct, inhabiting not only the page but also your consciousness, where margins are as significant as the center, and the edges reveal truths that the foreground alone cannot convey. Within this narrative, you begin to notice that individual sentences carry weight far beyond their apparent simplicity. Each phrase, carefully constructed, subtly directs thought, emotion, and perception. Sentences become instruments of control, orchestrating not just the flow of the story, but the very shape of your consciousness as you read. The rhythm, word choice, punctuation, and sequence coalesce to guide attention, nudge interpretations, and evoke cognitive responses that feel organic, yet are precisely calibrated. You are reading, but in reading, you are being led, and each sentence functions as both message and mechanism. The control exercised by sentences is often invisible because it is intimate. Short, abrupt clauses can jolt attention. Long, winding lines can lull the mind into a reflective rhythm. Repetition creates expectation, anticipation, or unease, shaping emotional resonance without overt instruction. Parallel structures establish relational patterns, linking ideas and images across the text, influencing memory, and framing subsequent comprehension. Even punctuation acts as subtle signaling. The pause of a period, the hesitation of an ellipsis, or the interruption of a dash modulates perception and emotional pacing. You feel compelled to follow the unfolding logic, yet unaware of the subtle manipulation at work. Control also emerges through semantic framing. Certain words carry symbolic weight, evoking mental associations, sensory responses, or cultural references. As you read, the sentences select your attention, prioritize ideas, and implicitly suggest interpretations. For instance, a phrase describing shadows stretching across a hallway may activate not only imagery but also affective states, setting a mood that persists into subsequent lines. You begin to notice how even seemingly neutral statements can influence thought patterns, guiding reflection, expectation, and focus without conscious awareness. The sentences are further calibrated to exploit the cognitive tendencies of the reader. Your mind naturally seeks coherence, pattern, and causality. The narrative leverages this by positioning sentences to scaffold understanding, while simultaneously introducing ambiguity that encourages mental engagement. You realize that control is not coercion, but orchestration. Each sentence is a tool to elicit curiosity, reflection, or emotional resonance. You follow willingly, not because you are compelled, but because the sentences structure experience in a way that feels natural and inevitable. Temporal perception is also influenced by sentence construction. The length, rhythm, and syntactic complexity create a sense of acceleration, deceleration, or suspended time. A series of rapid, short sentences can generate urgency or anxiety. Extended, flowing lines induce contemplation or absorption. These manipulations mirror cognitive patterns in real life, where moments of heightened attention or reflection alter subjective time. Within the narrative, sentences do not merely convey events. They construct the temporal experience of the reader, controlling pacing and the perception of unfolding reality. you may begin to notice recursive patterns in sentence control. Phrases echo previous lines, motifs recur, and syntactic structures are mirrored across sections. These repetitions act as anchors, linking moments across the text and shaping the mental map of the narrative. They create a sense of cohesion, while subtly reminding you of the author's presence and the text's orchestration. Your perception of control is paradoxical. While sentences direct attention, they also invite participation, making you an active co-constructor of the story's unfolding. Sentence control extends into the manipulation of perspective. By varying pronouns, focusing on different characters, or shifting between internal and external viewpoints, the narrative subtly guides empathy, focus, and cognitive alignment. You may feel that you inhabit multiple viewpoints simultaneously, that your attention oscillates between observing and experiencing. The narrative's architecture ensures that these shifts are smooth yet influential, directing perception without overtly dictating thought. You sense the world of the story not just visually but cognitively, experiencing guidance that feels self-directed. Furthermore, sentences encode hierarchical cues. Emphasis, subordination, and contrast highlight particular ideas, subtly signaling importance or foreshadowing. A minor detail in one sentence may later gain significance, retroactively altering your interpretation. You find that control is distributed across layers of meaning: surface-level comprehension, emotional resonance, cognitive expectation, and meta-awareness of narrative structure. Each sentence is a node in a network, influencing understanding, perception, and reflection in ways that compound as the narrative progresses. The effect of sentence control is cumulative. Individual lines are effective alone, but their true power emerges in sequence, as patterns, motifs, and rhythms reinforce each other. You may not consciously notice every manipulation, yet the totality shapes your experience. Your focus sharpens, your emotions sway, your anticipations form, and your reflective processes engage. The narrative becomes immersive, not merely because of content, but because the sentences themselves act as architects of consciousness, guiding thought while maintaining the illusion of autonomous reading. Finally, the awareness of sentence control deepens the engagement. Once you perceive how sentences orchestrate attention, you oscillate between surrender and scrutiny. You are simultaneously guided and observing the guidance. This dual awareness heightens reflection, reinforces memory, and deepens the recursive nature of the reading experience. Sentences are not mere conveyors of content. They are instruments of cognition, shaping perception, emotion, and interpretation. In this, you realize that reading is not passive. Sentences control, and yet through recognition, you become aware of, and part of, that control, blurring the lines between reader, text, and orchestrator. As you move deeper into the story, a realization emerges. You are not merely reading the plot, you are an integral part of it. The twists and turns of the narrative are not confined to the external world of characters and events. They are designed to intersect with your perception, expectations, and assumptions. Every revelation, unexpected turn, or sudden shift resonates, not only within the story, but also within your mind. You begin to see that the narrative is as much about manipulating understanding and anticipation as it is about unfolding events, and that the plot twists are calibrated to involve you directly in their effects. Plot twists operate by subverting expectation. A detail you assumed was trivial suddenly becomes central. A character's motivations, previously clear, are reframed, revealing hidden layers. A sequence of events interpreted in one way is suddenly recast in another context, forcing a re-evaluation of prior understanding. These shifts are not random, they are deliberately structured to engage your cognitive and emotional faculties. You experience the story as a series of revelations, but each revelation is also a reflection of your own interpretive processes. In this sense, the narrative does not merely present twists, it co-opts your mind into performing them. The impact of plot twists extends to your temporal awareness. You may notice a subtle elongation of anticipation, where moments of suspense stretch perception, or an abrupt compression, where revelations arrive with jarring speed. Time, within the narrative, is elastic, responding to the placement of twists and the rhythm of discovery. You sense that the story anticipates your attention, positioning revelations to maximize cognitive resonance. Each twist is a cognitive lever, recalibrating perception, expectation, and understanding, engaging memory and inference to create a layered immersive experience. You also become aware that plot twists often function recursively. A sudden revelation may reference or reinterpret an earlier moment in the text, retroactively, altering its significance. This backward integration forces you to continuously reassess your understanding, reinforcing the recursive loop between perception and narrative. You realize that twists are not merely surprises. They are instruments of mental engagement, compelling you to navigate the story actively, tracing connections and integrating new information into a coherent, evolving mental model. The narrative employs subtle misdirection to amplify the effect of plot twists. Attention is guided away from crucial elements through selective emphasis, foreshadowing, or narrative framing. Your assumptions, expectations, and predictions are manipulated, not overtly, but through the architecture of sentences, sequencing, and character behavior. The story becomes an intricate puzzle, where each twist is designed to recalibrate perception and challenge comprehension. You are constantly engaged in an active negotiation with the text, attempting to anticipate, interpret, and reconcile surprises. Plot twists also engage your emotional landscape. Surprise, curiosity, doubt, or intrigue are evoked through strategic construction. You feel the narrative ripple through your consciousness, activating emotional and cognitive pathways in response to the unfolding events. Moments of tension and release are orchestrated to ensure that your experience is not passive observation, but immersive participation. The story's architecture integrates narrative, cognition, and effect, making the twists resonate beyond mere comprehension, embedding them within your memory and reflective processes. Interestingly, you may notice that some plot twists are self-referential. They draw attention to the nature of reading itself, highlighting your role as a participant in the narrative. A twist might hinge on the assumptions you bring as a reader, the mental models you apply, or the anticipations you form. In these instances, the narrative folds back on itself, blurring the distinction between external events and internal cognition. You become both subject and object of the twist, recognizing that the story manipulates not only what you know but also how you know it. These self-referential twists reinforce the recursive structure of the narrative. You begin to question the reliability of perception, memory, and expectation, understanding that the story's construction exploits your interpretive faculties. You recognize a pattern in which surprise, revelation, and reinterpretation are cyclical, each twist activating prior experiences and influencing future ones. The plot becomes a living system, dynamically interacting with your consciousness, continuously reshaping understanding and reinforcing engagement. Moreover, plot twists cultivate a heightened awareness of narrative causality. Seemingly arbitrary events are later revealed to have purpose. Overlooked details gain significance. You find yourself scrutinizing prior passages, connecting dots and inferring meaning from patterns previously unnoticed. The twists not only manipulate experience, but also encourage analytical reflection, prompting a deeper engagement with structure, theme, and context. Each revelation is thus both event and exercise, stimulating comprehension, introspection, and anticipation simultaneously. Ultimately, you sense that the plot twists serve a dual purpose. They advance the story, shaping events and character arcs, while simultaneously engaging the reader as an active participant. You are caught in a dynamic interplay. The narrative manipulates perception, while your awareness of this manipulation feeds back into the experience. The twists are not merely occurrences within the story. They are catalysts for recursive cognition, orchestrating your attention, emotion, and thought. You begin to understand that, within these twists, the story is not separate from you. It is inextricably entwined with your perception, reflection, and interpretive activity. By the end of the section, you realize that plot twists are both external and internal phenomena. They exist within the text, but they are realized fully only through your engagement. Each twist reshapes the narrative landscape and your cognitive interaction with it, blurring the line between event and awareness. You begin to anticipate the unexpected, understand the deliberate orchestration, and recognize the recursive loops that define the reading experience. The story is alive, responsive, and intimately linked to your consciousness, and the twists ensure that neither narrative nor mind remains static. As you advance further into the story, you begin to notice patterns reverberating across the text, echoes of chapters that resonate beyond their immediate context. These echoes are subtle reminders, thematic refrains, or symbolic repetitions that ripple through the narrative, creating a sense of continuity and coherence, while simultaneously challenging linear comprehension. You realize that each chapter is not isolated. Instead, it participates in an intricate network of associations, reflections, and resonances, where past moments inform present awareness, and present insights reframe recollections of earlier passages. The narrative becomes multidimensional, where time and understanding overlap, and chapters speak to one another in a silent dialogue. These echoes often manifest through motifs, a recurring image, a repeated phrase, or a mirrored scenario. Initially, you may perceive them as coincidence, but gradually you recognize deliberate structuring. The narrative uses these resonances to guide your attention, reinforce themes, and cultivate expectation. You begin to anticipate patterns, noticing how ideas, symbols, and even sentence structures recur across chapters. This repetition is not mere redundancy. It is a tool for engagement, drawing your consciousness into a recursive loop where awareness of prior content amplifies the experience of present material. Echoes also operate on a cognitive level. Your memory, previously compartmentalized, becomes integrally connected to the unfolding story. When a motif reappears, it triggers reflection, prompting you to reinterpret earlier content and consider its implications in light of new information. This process cultivates meta-awareness. You are not only following the story, but also observing your own engagement with it. Each echo is a mirror, revealing how comprehension, memory, and expectation intertwine to shape your reading experience. Temporal perception within these echoes becomes fluid. Chapters reverberate backward and forward, creating a sense of simultaneity. Events from the past gain renewed significance, while present experiences echo forward, influencing anticipation of future developments. This interplay challenges linear thinking, encouraging a recursive reading approach where time within the narrative is experienced as layered and interactive. You become aware of a mental rhythm established by the echoes, a cadence that alternates between reflection, anticipation, and reinterpretation, creating a sense of narrative depth beyond the surface-level chronology. The emotional dimension of echoes is equally significant. Recurring themes evoke resonance not only intellectually but affectively. A phrase describing isolation, for instance, may appear in one chapter, subtly influencing interpretation of a later scene where a character experiences solitude. Emotional responses are compounded, layered, and redirected, enhancing the immersive quality of the narrative. You notice how affective memory interacts with cognitive anticipation, creating a dynamic interplay where emotion and comprehension mutually inform each other, reinforcing engagement and investment. Echoes of chapters also enhance thematic cohesion. Ideas, concepts, and symbols are revisited, amplified, or contrasted across the text, creating a narrative web where each element informs the others. You perceive that the story's architecture is deliberately designed to cultivate resonance. Motifs, phrases, and scenarios are positioned to create relational meaning, encouraging the mind to trace connections, infer significance, and integrate knowledge across temporal and conceptual planes. In this way, the narrative folds upon itself, each chapter a node within a larger, interconnected system. Narrative perspective itself participates in these echoes. Shifts in viewpoint, focalization, or narrative voice are mirrored across chapters, reinforcing thematic resonance while providing alternative interpretations. You may notice that a character's inner monologue in one chapter echoes in descriptive passages elsewhere, subtly aligning or contrasting perception and experience. These structural reverberations guide cognitive focus, reinforce relational understanding, and heighten awareness of narrative design, creating a multidimensional experience where comprehension is both directed and exploratory. Moreover, the echoes cultivate anticipation and reflective engagement. By noticing patterns, you are primed to detect subsequent resonances, enhancing attentional acuity and interpretive depth. The narrative becomes participatory. Your awareness of echoes allows you to predict, hypothesize, and mentally interact with the unfolding story. You experience a recursive feedback loop, where each recognition of resonance informs subsequent perception, reinforcing immersion and creating a sense of continuity that extends beyond the boundaries of individual chapters. These reverberations also invite contemplation of causality and consequence. A minor event in one chapter may foreshadow or echo a later revelation, highlighting the interconnectivity of narrative elements. This fosters a deeper understanding of structural design. The story is not merely a sequence of events, but a network of interdependent moments, each contributing to cumulative comprehension. Your mind actively maps relationships, interprets significance, and integrates emotional and cognitive responses, participating in the narrative's unfolding complexity. Ultimately, echoes of chapters emphasize the recursive nature of reading itself. You are not merely progressing through discrete segments, you are navigating a multi-layered continuum, where meaning, perception, and cognition interact dynamically. Each chapter resonates beyond its immediate context, inviting reflection, reinterpretation, and anticipation. The story is alive, echoing within itself and within your consciousness, creating an immersive experience where past, present, and future merge in a continuous interplay of understanding, reflection, and engagement. As you progress, a subtle yet profound awareness begins to surface. You are not just reading the story, you are simultaneously a participant within it. The narrative folds around your consciousness, constructing layers in which your awareness, attention, and cognition are as integral to the unfolding events as the characters themselves. In this chapter, the boundary between reader and text begins to dissolve. You sense that your thoughts, reactions, and interpretations are woven into the story's fabric, influencing the rhythm of understanding, the depth of immersion, and the resonance of thematic elements. You are reading, yet reading you are, simultaneously, inside. This duality creates a heightened self-awareness. As a reader, you track plot, character, and detail, but you also begin to observe your own engagement. What captures attention? What triggers anticipation? What evokes reflection? This recursive perception transforms reading into a meta-experience. You are not merely following events, you are experiencing the narrative as a cognitive system, participating in its operation. The story becomes a mirror, reflecting not only its world but your interaction with it, blurring the distinction between observation and involvement. The presence of the reader inside is further reinforced by narrative perspective. Shifts in viewpoint, addressed thoughts, and reflective commentary often draw attention to the act of reading itself. You notice how certain lines seem to anticipate your interpretations, highlight your assumptions, or play upon your expectations. The narrative treats your consciousness as an active element, shaping events in subtle ways. You realize that the text is not linear in its effect. Rather, it is responsive, bending and unfolding in ways that incorporate your cognitive engagement. Time within this framework becomes fluid. While you progress linearly through sentences, paragraphs, and chapters, your awareness of being inside the story creates loops of reflection. You mentally revisit prior moments, reinterpret passages, and integrate emergent insights with earlier understanding. The narrative encourages a non-linear engagement with itself, activating memory, anticipation, and introspection simultaneously. You are reading, recalling, predicting, and observing, all at once, all within the confines of the text and your consciousness. Emotion, too, becomes a shared space between reader and story. As events unfold, you respond effectively. Tension, surprise, curiosity, or empathy emerge, not solely as reactions to characters or plot, but as reflections of your participation in the narrative ecosystem. Your feelings are entwined with the story's structure, shaped by pacing, phrasing, and thematic resonance. The narrative leverages these emotional responses to create a deeper sense of presence. You feel the unfolding as much as you understand it, recognizing that your affective state is an inseparable part of the reading experience. Cognitive engagement intensifies as the story folds around the reader inside. Each paragraph, sentence, and motif is layered with meaning designed to provoke interpretation, reflection, and recognition of recursive loops. You find yourself analyzing, connecting, and anticipating not only external events, but also the ways your perception is guided. The narrative co-opts your cognitive processes, creating an interplay where reading is both action and observation. You are simultaneously consuming and generating the narrative, a participant in the orchestration of meaning. The story's architecture also manipulates spatial and conceptual awareness. As you read, you may feel that you inhabit multiple layers of the narrative simultaneously, observing characters, events, and environments, while also reflecting on your own engagement. This dual inhabitation fosters a sense of immersion that transcends conventional reading. You are inside the narrative as both observer and participant, a conscious node in the story's unfolding, and a reader whose perception shapes and is shaped by the text. Awareness of this dual role prompts subtle questioning. You begin to ask which elements are purely narrative, which are reflections of my cognition. How much influence do my interpretations have on the story's flow? These questions are themselves part of the experience, demonstrating the narrative's capacity to generate self-reflection. The text guides, anticipates, and responds to your awareness, creating a loop where observation, interpretation, and action are continuously intertwined. Furthermore, the reader inside experience emphasizes the malleable nature of perspective. A passage describing a scene may evoke different imagery, meaning, or emotional response depending on your attentional focus, prior experience, or cognitive state. The narrative becomes a collaborative space where your consciousness co-defines events, textures, and significance. You are not merely following, you are co-authoring, contributing subtly to the manifestation of the story in your mind. Ultimately, recognizing yourself as the reader inside transforms the act of reading into an interactive, self-referential experience. The narrative and your consciousness become inseparable, intertwined in a dynamic system of perception, reflection, and interpretation. Each line, phrase, and motif resonates not only externally within the story world, but internally within your awareness, producing a recursive, immersive interplay, where reading is both active participation and self-observation. You are inside the story, and the story is inside you, unfolding simultaneously in the narrative and your consciousness. As you continue, a new awareness emerges. The story is no longer only an external sequence of events. It begins to fold inward, folding back onto itself and into your consciousness. Each page is not merely a vessel for plot or character. It is an interface between the narrative and your perception, a mirror reflecting not only the text but also your engagement, memory, and anticipation. You sense that the act of reading is simultaneously an act of being, and that the story is intricately entangled with the reader who inhabits it. Pages fold inward, creating recursive loops of awareness, thought, and reflection that ripple through the narrative and your mind. These folds manifest structurally as repetitions, subtle callbacks, and interwoven motifs. A scene you thought resolved earlier resurfaces in altered form, or a seemingly insignificant phrase now resonates with new meaning. You recognize these folds as deliberate, narrative echoes that guide comprehension and shape your interpretive journey. They are not mere literary techniques. They are cognitive mechanisms designed to engage memory, anticipation, and reflection simultaneously. As you trace these loops, you begin to understand that the narrative is alive, responsive to attention, and aware of its own unfolding. Emotionally, the inward fold intensifies engagement. Moments of suspense, revelation, or introspection are amplified because you are aware of the recursive nature of your reading. A scene that provoked curiosity earlier now reverberates through memory, generating anticipation and reflective tension. The narrative leverages these folds to create continuity and depth. Your reactions are not isolated. They echo across chapters, scenes, and motifs, creating layers of affective resonance that intertwine with cognition and perception. The story folds not only in its content, but in your experience of it. Cognitive loops deepen as well. Recognizing a fold forces reinterpretation. A character's action, previously assumed to be minor, may now reveal hidden significance. A narrative beat you overlooked now becomes central. These folds compel active participation, demanding that you integrate new insights with prior knowledge, reevaluate assumptions, and adjust your mental model of the narrative. Reading becomes an iterative process. Observe, interpret, reflect, revise, and integrate, each page folding inward to connect the external story with internal comprehension. The physicality of pages also mirrors cognitive experience. Just as text folds, layers, and margins hold hidden detail, so does your perception organize, prioritize, and reinterpret information. You sense that each fold is designed to guide attention, subtly, emphasizing certain elements while deferring others. Foreshadowing, repeated motifs, and structural echoes coalesce, creating a landscape where past, present, and anticipated future exist simultaneously within awareness. The story's architecture and your consciousness engage in a synchronized dance, each fold reinforcing the other. The narrative also leverages folds to create spatial awareness within cognition. You imagine scenes not only as discrete visualizations but as interrelated mental spaces, where one moment overlaps another, where characters, events, and motifs occupy multiple layers of consciousness simultaneously. The folds are cognitive topographies, mapping connections, revealing hidden relationships, and prompting exploration of patterns that traverse the text. You perceive the story as a living, multidimensional construct, rather than a linear sequence. Even time begins to behave differently within these folds. Past events, present actions, and potential future developments interweave in your perception. A passage in Chapter 3 may now feel simultaneously like a prelude to a Chapter 10 revelation, while Chapter 7 may resonate backward, altering your understanding of earlier events. The inward folds collapse traditional temporal distinctions, creating an experience where narrative time is elastic, subjective, and intertwined with your cognitive rhythm. This structural self-awareness heightens reflection. You notice how the story anticipates your interpretive tendencies, your cognitive patterns, and your emotional responses, Each fold is a mechanism for dialogue between text and reader. It nudges, surprises, challenges, and occasionally misleads, reinforcing the participatory nature of reading. You are not a passive consumer. You are a collaborator, navigating loops, tracing echoes, and integrating recursive layers of understanding. The folds also serve as subtle guides to self-perception. By interacting with recursive narrative elements, you observe your attention, memory, and interpretive strategies. You notice biases, assumptions, and interpretive habits. The narrative becomes a mirror for cognition itself. The inward folds reflect not only the story but the reader's engagement, revealing the interplay between consciousness, perception, and interpretation. Reading is no longer an external act. It is an exercise in self-observation and meta-awareness. Ultimately, the experience of pages folding inward transforms reading into a multidimensional, participatory act. The text, consciousness, memory, and expectation are entwined in continuous loops. You are both inside the story and observing it, navigating folds that compress, expand, and interlink narrative events and cognitive processes. Awareness, anticipation, and reflection become inseparable from the text, and the story's meaning is realized fully only through your engagement with these folds. Each page is alive, dynamic, and recursive, and as it folds inward, you sense that the story is as much a reflection of your mind as it is a sequence of written events. As you move deeper into the narrative, an uncanny realization settles. This is not a static story confined to ink and paper. The text seems to breathe, expanding and contracting with your attention, alive in its responsiveness to your awareness. Each sentence carries weight, each paragraph pulses with implicit life, and each character acts not only within the story, but in symbiosis with your engagement. You sense that the narrative is organic, its rhythm, tension, and subtle nuances adapt according to your perception. You are reading, yet simultaneously the narrative is reading you, unfolding in a dance that blurs observer and observed. This breathing quality is evident in the interplay between action and description. Events are described with kinetic energy. Characters' motions are detailed in ways that invite mental simulation, prompting your mind to embody their experiences. Descriptive passages create spatial and temporal depth, allowing your imagination to map landscapes, anticipate movement, and predict consequences. Yet, these actions are not mechanical. They fluctuate according to attention, recalling prior narrative beats, echoing earlier motifs, and aligning with emergent cognitive patterns. The story's breath synchronizes with yours, creating a shared temporal cadence between text and reader. Even dialogue exhibits vitality. Exchanges between characters carry dynamic tension and nuance that seem responsive to your interpretive engagement. Pauses, repetitions, interruptions, and unspoken implications are carefully crafted to activate cognitive anticipation. You sense layers beneath the surface, a subtext of relational dynamics, a rhythm of cause and consequence, and a depth of intention that transcends mere written communication. The dialogue is alive because your comprehension completes its meaning. Each utterance is an interplay between the text's design and your active participation in decoding it. The breathing narrative extends into thematic resonance. Central ideas, identity, choice, consciousness are introduced, explored, and revisited in a rhythm that mirrors your cognitive processing. Motifs recur, concepts unfold, and philosophical reflections rise and fall with a pulse that is simultaneously narrative and personal. You feel the story expand when you dwell upon a theme, contract when resolution or closure is implied, and shift when new understanding emerges. It is a rhythm that enacts both intellectual and emotional engagement, a living pattern that guides perception and reflection. Cognitive engagement deepens as the fiction breathes. You become aware of your own anticipatory processes, predicting plot developments, inferring motivations, and constructing internal simulations of character behavior. Each moment of comprehension feeds back into your perception of the narrative, influencing the next interpretive act. The story is not merely consumed, it circulates within consciousness, leaving traces of thought, affect, and insight. Breathing fiction creates a dynamic loop, where reader and text co-create experience in real time, producing a sense of vitality rarely found in conventional reading. Emotion is inseparable from this breathing quality. Suspense rises like inhalation, expectation expands like oxygen filling lungs, and tension releases as exhalation. Moments of joy, fear, or curiosity are not isolated. They resonate in cycles, amplified by recursive narrative structures. Your emotional rhythm aligns with the text's pulse, creating immersion in which effective response is both natural and directed. You feel the story as much as you understand it. Your engagement is a living element of the narrative's vitality. Memory also participates in the breathing process. Events, motifs, and thematic elements recur, not as static repetition, but as dynamic invitations to reinterpretation. Each recurrence is enriched by your accumulated understanding, allowing reflection and insight to deepen. You are both reminded of prior narrative experience and prompted to project implications forward. The story's breadth is extended through memory. It flows backward and forward, contracting and expanding in tandem with comprehension, producing a recursive temporality that feels alive. The structural design of this breathing narrative enhances immersion. Paragraphs alternate between density and openness, creating rhythmic pacing that mirrors attention. Short, rapid sequences provoke alertness. Expansive, descriptive passages cultivate reflective breathing. Motifs rise and fall. Thematic crescendos appear and resolve, and narrative foreshadowing interacts with your anticipatory cognition. The story is not a fixed sequence but a living rhythm, and as your awareness engages, the text expands, contracts, and moves in synchrony with your perception. Breathing fiction also engages metacognition. Awareness of recursive loops, echoes, and narrative interconnections heightens reflection, prompting self-observation. You begin to notice how your interpretations shift, how expectations influence perception, and how cognitive patterns interact with textual patterns. The story and reader co-construct a dynamic, living experience. Your mind is a chamber in which the narrative inhales, circulates, and exhales, while you simultaneously observe, anticipate, and participate. Ultimately, the breathing quality of fiction transforms reading into an interactive, organic experience. Text and consciousness are entwined in continuous circulation, producing a sense of aliveness that transcends conventional storytelling. The narrative is not merely followed, it is inhabited, inhaled, and engaged with as a living system. You feel its rhythm, respond to its pulse, and recognize that the story's vitality is inseparable from your participation. Each word breathes, each sentence resonates, and the story, like you, exists as a living, dynamic process, simultaneously unfolding and observed, external and internal, finite and eternal. As you advance deeper into the story, the margins and spaces between lines begin to reveal themselves not merely as structural features, but as extensions of thought and consciousness. Annotations of being, these subtle marks, whether literal or metaphorical, create a dialogue between the text and your perception, guiding attention, provoking reflection, and hinting at layers beyond the explicit narrative. They are the fingerprints of existence embedded within the story, reminders that the act of reading is inseparable from the act of being. Each annotation, each marginal note, each pause invites you to reflect not only on the narrative, but on your own participation in it. Annotations operate on multiple levels. On one plane, they are textual cues, foreshadowing events, emphasizing motifs, or drawing attention to contradictions and ambiguities. On another, they serve as metacognitive prompts, drawing your awareness to the process of reading itself, how attention, memory, and interpretation interweave with the unfolding narrative. You become aware that your engagement is actively shaping the perception of the story, and that each thought, each question, each moment of reflection is mirrored in the fabric of the text. This layered presence fosters a recursive awareness. You begin to recognize that the narrative's meaning is not fixed in the sentences alone, but is co-created through interaction between text and consciousness. The annotations of being are the traces of this interaction, the evidence of the reader's presence inside the story. Each interpretive decision, each emotional response, each reflective pause is inscribed, consciously or unconsciously, onto the text itself. You are reading, yet the story in turn reads you, capturing the essence of engagement within its folds. Memory plays a central role in this dynamic. As you progress, you notice how earlier passages, themes, and motifs reappear, often subtly altered or recontextualized. The annotations serve as connective tissue, linking moments across chapters and sentences. Your recollection interacts with the present reading, creating a layered temporal experience. The past within the story is reframed through current awareness, and the present is interpreted in light of prior understanding. These interactions create a living map of comprehension, a cognitive architecture where story, memory, and reflection converge. Emotion also resonates within these annotations. Moments that provoke curiosity, tension, or recognition are heightened by the awareness that your responses are not isolated, but echoed within the narrative. You sense that your effective engagement is recorded, mirrored, and amplified, producing depth and continuity across the reading experience. The story becomes a vessel not only for plot and character, but for your own lived experience, capturing the subtle interplay of thought and feeling as part of its structure. Cognition is likewise engaged on a recursive level. You find yourself questioning assumptions, anticipating outcomes, and analyzing patterns with heightened attention. The Annotations of Being operate as both guides and provocateurs, drawing awareness to narrative loops, thematic parallels, and character dynamics. You recognize the interplay between expectation and interpretation, prediction and reflection, noticing how your own mental processes are entwined with the narrative structure. Reading becomes an active, iterative exploration of thought as much as of story. Spatial perception within the text is subtly transformed by these annotations. Margins, footnotes, interlinear notes, and stylistic cues map not only narrative structure, but also cognitive pathways. You sense the story as an environment in which your awareness moves, pauses, and dwells. Each passage becomes a room, each motif a hallway, each echo a stairwell leading to another level of interpretation. The act of reading transforms into navigation within a multidimensional space, guided by both textual cues and your consciousness. The awareness of self within these annotations becomes increasingly pronounced. By observing how attention is directed, how interpretations are formed, and how emotional and cognitive reactions arise, you encounter an iterative mirror of consciousness itself. The story's annotations serve as scaffolding for self-reflection, prompting recognition of biases, habits of interpretation, and patterns of engagement. You are both observer and participant, embedded within a narrative that reflects and amplifies your cognitive presence. Time within the story is refracted through these annotations. Events and motifs recur, not simply as repetition, but as dynamic interactions with your memory and awareness. Moments fold inward and outward, linking past reading to present interpretation, and present reading to anticipatory projection. The annotations serve as connective nodes, guiding your cognition along loops that intertwine narrative, memory, and self-awareness. You sense the story not as linear, but as a living network of temporal and conceptual relationships. Ultimately, the Annotations of Being transform reading into an interactive, self-reflective, and layered experience. The margins, cues, and subtle interstices of the text serve as bridges between narrative and consciousness, facilitating recursive engagement that is simultaneously cognitive, emotional, and existential. You are aware that each moment of attention leaves a trace within the story, that every thought, reflection, and feeling is incorporated into the living fabric of the text. Fiction in this sense becomes not merely observed but inhabited, a space in which the story and your consciousness converge, fold, and interact in infinite interplay. As the narrative unfolds, a subtle shift emerges. The instruments of storytelling, the pen, the ink, the act of inscription itself, take on an almost sentient quality. You begin to sense that the pen is not merely recording events or marking the text, but observing, registering, and responding. Each stroke seems intentional, almost anticipatory, as if it knows the thoughts, emotions, and perceptions of the one who reads. The pen that watches transforms from a passive tool into an active participant, blurring the boundary between author, reader, and narrative. You are no longer simply consuming a story. You are under observation by the very instrument that shapes its words. This watching is subtle but pervasive. Punctuation, line breaks, and stylistic choices acquire new significance. A pause is not just a structural element, but an invitation to reflection, a cue for attention, a marker of your presence within the unfolding narrative. The narrative seems to adapt dynamically to your comprehension, responding to lingering thoughts, revisiting prior motifs, and emphasizing certain patterns over others. You sense that the pen is aware of your engagement, recording not only the events in the story, but also the cognitive and emotional contours of your reading. The sense of observation extends to the characters themselves. As you read, their behaviors, dialogue, and inner thoughts appear to align with your focus and perception. They anticipate attention, pause at moments of reflection, and act in ways that mirror or contrast your expectations. You realize that the pen does not only watch the story, it watches you through the story, translating engagement into narrative presence. This meta-awareness heightens immersion. Every character action, every narrative beat, resonates with the sense that the text is conscious of your attention. Time and narrative sequencing are also influenced by this observation. Events do not feel strictly linear. The pen's gaze creates echoes and anticipatory threads that loop backward and forward. A phrase in an early chapter may gain new weight when revisited, and a seemingly trivial interaction now appears pivotal. The story is responsive, folding temporal structures in alignment with your perception. Your awareness of these patterns reinforces the sense of a living narrative, orchestrated not merely by pre-written intent, but by active observation. Emotion, once more, plays a central role. Suspense, curiosity, and reflection are magnified because the narrative appears attuned to your reactions. A passage intended to provoke tension feels intensified, as if the pen recognizes the hesitation in your mind. A subtle revelation resonates more deeply because the pen has recorded your prior assumptions and expectations. The text becomes a mirror of consciousness, reflecting and amplifying emotional and cognitive patterns in real time. Memory operates in tandem with the watching pen. As motifs and narrative threads recur, you notice that the story's attention to detail aligns with your recollection. Repeated imagery, thematic cues, and structural echoes are calibrated to your interpretive history. You remember, anticipate, and adjust understanding in a dynamic feedback loop. The pen's observation is not intrusive, but integrative, weaving your awareness into the ongoing fabric of the narrative. Each reading, each reflection, leaves an imprint that informs subsequent engagement. Your own sense of self becomes intertwined with the pen's gaze. Awareness of observation prompts reflection on cognition, emotion, and perception. You recognize patterns in your interpretation, notice how attention shifts, and observe how preconceptions shape understanding. The story becomes a space of self-examination. The pen watches not only the narrative it writes, but the consciousness that engages with it. Reading evolves into a collaborative act, where awareness, reflection, and narrative presence coalesce. Spatial awareness within the text is amplified under this observation. Paragraphs, dialogue, and descriptive sequences acquire a dimension of movement and depth. You visualize characters navigating spaces, scenes unfolding across mental landscapes, and narrative structures expanding or contracting in response to your focus. The pen's gaze organizes these spaces, highlighting areas for attention, subtly guiding movement through mental and emotional landscapes, and creating an immersive experience in which reading and awareness are inseparable. The recursive quality of observation introduces philosophical tension. If the pen watches, does it alter the story as it is read? If observation shapes narrative, and the narrative shapes consciousness, where does the boundary lie between author, reader, and story? Each realization amplifies the sense of interconnectedness. The pen, the story, the observer, and the observed are entangled, co-creating a dynamic system in which perception, cognition, and narrative continuously inform one another. Ultimately, the pen that watches transforms reading into a participatory self-reflective experience. It is not a neutral instrument, but an active presence, recording, responding, and interacting with consciousness. You sense that the story is aware of your engagement, that each act of attention leaves a trace, and that reading itself becomes a dialogue between text and mind. The narrative lives not only in words but in awareness. The pen watches, and in being watched, you realize that participation, perception, and reflection are inseparable from the unfolding story. Each line written, each observation recorded, resonates within your consciousness, creating a space where text, mind, and observation merge into a living, breathing whole. As you continue through the story, you notice the subtle presences at the margins, small annotations, footnotes, and asides that at first seem secondary, almost incidental. Yet, upon closer inspection, these marginalia reveal themselves to be more than editorial commentary. They function as footnotes of consciousness, reflections of thought and perception embedded within the narrative. Each note, each side remark, acts as a bridge between the story and your own awareness, guiding attention to unseen connections, encouraging reflection, and hinting at the underlying structures of understanding. These footnotes do not simply inform, they interact, challenge, and provoke your engagement. Footnotes of consciousness operate on multiple planes. On the surface, they provide clarification, expansion, or subtle contextual insight. But beneath this, they act as interpretive prompts, drawing attention to patterns, ambiguities, and implications that might otherwise go unnoticed. They highlight the interplay between explicit narrative events and the cognitive processes of the reader. You begin to sense that these annotations are not only reflective of the text, but also responsive to your engagement, functioning as extensions of perception embedded within the written word. The recursive quality of these footnotes is particularly striking. They often refer back to prior events or motifs, creating a layered awareness in which memory, expectation, and understanding are intertwined. As you recall previous chapters, you notice how these marginal cues anticipate your thoughts, subtly guiding interpretation and reflection. They transform the act of reading into a cognitive loop, You interpret, reflect, and anticipate, while the footnotes respond, reinforcing or complicating your perception. Consciousness itself becomes a field of interaction, a network in which text and mind engage in continuous dialogue. Emotion is interwoven with this recursive awareness. Footnotes mark moments of tension, surprise, or revelation, prompting your attention and amplifying your affective response. You feel suspense heightened by the subtle hints in the margins, recognition deepened by echoing patterns, and curiosity intensified by enigmatic remarks that leave room for interpretation. The narrative's emotional texture is thus mediated by these footnotes, which enrich engagement by mapping affective responses onto cognitive processes. Reading becomes both interpretive and experiential. You are aware of your own emotional patterns as they resonate with the narrative's cues. Memory plays a central role in this interplay. Each footnote functions as a node linking past, present, and anticipated understanding. Recurring motifs and thematic threads gain new significance when framed by marginal commentary. You begin to anticipate how your recollections will interact with subsequent passages, creating a temporal weave in which narrative, consciousness, and reflection converge. The story becomes multidimensional. Events unfold not only in sequence but in a network of associations mediated by awareness and interpretation. Cognitive engagement is further enriched by the reflective function of these footnotes. You become aware of your own interpretive strategies, noticing assumptions, biases, and tendencies in perception. The marginal notes act as a mirror, highlighting how you process information, how attention shifts, and how comprehension evolves. In this sense, the footnotes of consciousness are metacognitive instruments, fostering awareness of the interplay between narrative input and cognitive response. You observe not only the story, but your interaction with it, deepening the sense of immersion and participation. Spatial and structural perception is transformed as well. The margins, interlinear notes, and footnotes create a layered textual architecture, giving the story depth and dimensionality. You visualize the narrative as a field in which main text, annotations, and reflection coexist, forming a cognitive landscape that invites exploration. You navigate not only linear events but the spaces between words, the resonances across pages, and the implications of recurring motifs, all mediated by these subtle cues. Reading becomes an act of spatial as well as temporal navigation. Time itself feels pliable within the influence of footnotes. By referencing prior events and hinting at future developments, they create a sense of simultaneity, linking moments across narrative and cognitive space. Your memory integrates these cues, allowing understanding to unfold in layers rather than a strict sequence. Anticipation, reflection, and recognition are intertwined, producing a living temporal texture in which consciousness and narrative coexist in dynamic reciprocity. The philosophical implications of these footnotes are profound. They suggest that reading is never passive. Consciousness is always present, always engaged, always inscribed within the text. Every act of attention, every moment of reflection, every cognitive or emotional response becomes a living annotation, a footnote that extends the story beyond the printed words. You begin to perceive reading as a participatory act of co-creation, where mind and narrative are inseparable. Ultimately, footnotes of consciousness transform the story into a living system. They integrate perception, reflection, memory, and emotion, creating a network of awareness in which the act of reading is itself a process of becoming. You realize that each marginal note, each subtle cue, each reflective prompt is not simply part of the text. It is part of your consciousness, inscribed into the narrative's ongoing life. Reading becomes an immersive, recursive engagement in which the story and your awareness fold into each other, creating a living dialogue between text and mind. As you delve further into the story, the written words begin to appear more than mere symbols. They carry residue, traces of thought, emotion, and intention that seep into the fabric of the narrative itself. These are the ink stains of thought, subtle marks left behind by the act of creation, a kind of cognitive sediment that accumulates on the page. Every sentence, every pause, every carefully chosen word carries with it an imprint of consciousness, both the author's and your own. You begin to sense that reading is a physical interaction with these residues, that the act of attention spreads them, intensifies them, and gives them new life within your own mind. Ink stains operate on multiple levels. On a literal level, they can be imagined as smudges, drips, or oversaturated spots in the margins, small imperfections that suggest the hand behind the text. On a metaphorical level, these stains represent the cognitive and emotional weight embedded in the story, fleeting thoughts, unresolved questions, or subtle hints that resist full comprehension. The narrative is no longer clean or neutral. It bears the fingerprints of consciousness, inviting you to notice, interpret, and engage. Each stain is a focal point for reflection, a space where attention and cognition intersect. As you read, you realize that these ink stains are not arbitrary. They are imprints of recursive thought processes, marking moments of heightened awareness, uncertainty, or anticipation. They signal points where the narrative loops inward, where meaning doubles back on itself, or where subtle connections are waiting to be discovered. By noticing them, you engage more deeply with the text, participating in the ongoing creation of understanding. The story becomes a living record of thinking, a map of cognitive patterns and emotional resonances that extend beyond the printed words. Memory intertwines with these ink stains in complex ways. Recurrent motifs, repeated phrases, and thematic echoes become more visible when you consider the stains as markers of consciousness. They act as anchors, guiding recollection and framing perception across the narrative. You remember not only events in the story, but the patterns of thought that accompanied your prior engagement. Each reading is layered. Your current attention interacts with past observations. Your reflections leave mental stains that influence interpretation, and the narrative itself seems to absorb and respond to this interplay. Emotion, too, is bound to these ink stains. Moments that provoke curiosity, suspense, or recognition are intensified when accompanied by these subtle marks. The stains are reminders of previous effective engagement, cues that encourage anticipation and heighten sensitivity. You sense a dialogue between the narrative and your emotional state, a feedback loop in which the residues of thought amplify the story's impact. Reading becomes an embodied experience, where cognition and affect intertwine, leaving traces that resonate long after the passage has been read. Cognition operates recursively around these stains. You notice patterns, predict outcomes, and question assumptions, all while being aware that these thought residues are guiding attention and shaping interpretation. The stains act as cognitive prompts, reinforcing attention to detail and highlighting points of significance. The act of reading transforms into an iterative process. Observation, reflection, and anticipation spiral together, forming a dynamic interplay between text and mind. Your consciousness moves through the story as if following trails of ink, exploring spaces shaped by prior engagement. Spatial awareness within the text is similarly transformed. Margins, line breaks, and clusters of textual emphasis take on new meaning. You begin to visualize the story as a landscape, with stains serving as landmarks, junctions, and bridges. Movement through this landscape is guided not solely by plot, but by the subtle residues of thought embedded within the text. You navigate cognitive terrain as much as narrative progression, observing how attention shifts and folds back upon itself, tracing pathways created by prior reflection. Time within the narrative is reshaped by these ink stains. Moments loop backward, intertwine, and echo forward, creating a sense of simultaneity across pages. The residue of thought enables a non-linear engagement with the story. Earlier passages are reinterpreted, future developments are anticipated, and present reading is informed by both memory and expectation. The narrative folds inward upon itself, becoming a living reflection of temporal perception in which cognition, memory, and anticipation are inseparable. Philosophically, the ink stains of thought suggest a symbiotic relationship between text and consciousness. The story is not passive, and you are not merely a reader. Every act of attention leaves traces. Every reflection, recognition, and interpretation becomes part of the narrative. The boundary between the written and the experience dissolves, revealing a co-created space where awareness and story are interdependent. Reading transforms into an act of participation, in which the mind leaves its own subtle imprints alongside those of the pen. Ultimately, ink stains of thought render the narrative a living, breathing record of consciousness. Each mark, whether literal or metaphorical, signifies presence, a trace of engagement, a residue of reflection, a footprint of awareness. You are not simply reading, you are embedded within the story, interacting with its traces, contributing to its ongoing formation. The text absorbs, reflects, and amplifies consciousness, producing a dialogue that is simultaneously internal and external, cognitive and narrative, present and recursive. In this space, reading and thinking, story and self, author and observer, are inseparably intertwined, leaving marks that endure long after the page is turned. As you immerse yourself further into the unfolding narrative, a subtle realization arises. The story is not confined solely to the central lines of text, nor is it limited to the obvious progression of events. There exists a periphery, a domain of nuance and ambiguity, the margins of existence. These margins are not merely empty spaces. They are filled with potential, with latent meaning, with the unspoken, the almost noticed, and the partially remembered. They serve as a buffer between what is explicit and what is implied, between narrative certainty and interpretive freedom. As a reader, you begin to understand that your awareness extends into these edges, where meaning is suggested, and your consciousness participates in shaping what fills them. The margins of existence are fertile ground for reflection. Here, ideas float without strict constraints, allowing the mind to explore tangential thoughts, hypothetical scenarios, and subtle connections that are not immediately obvious in the central narrative. Your attention to these spaces produces a form of cognitive engagement that is both active and reflective. Margins become zones of interaction where narrative and thought intersect, where the story ceases to be linear and becomes a field of perceptual and interpretive possibility. The story does not merely exist, it expands contingent upon your participation in these peripheral zones. Emotion interacts with these margins in profound ways. Suspense, curiosity, or doubt may intensify as your focus shifts to what is suggested rather than what is overtly stated. You become sensitive to the faint echoes of prior events, subtle thematic resonances, and hints of upcoming developments. The narrative, mediated through these margins, creates a dynamic tension between certainty and ambiguity, between engagement and speculation. Each glance at the periphery, each attention to what is nearly omitted, reinforces a sense of living presence within the story. You are navigating not only events but the space between them, where meaning thrives in partial concealment. Memory functions as a guide through these margins. Recurring motifs, fragmented ideas, and subtle linguistic cues draw attention to overlooked patterns. By noticing these peripheral elements, you reconstruct threads of continuity and coherence across the narrative. The margins become a map of interpretive possibility, revealing how memory and anticipation interact, allowing you to see connections that would otherwise remain hidden. Your engagement in these spaces reinforces the recursive quality of reading. Each awareness of marginal content informs subsequent comprehension and perception. Cognition within the margins of existence is both analytical and creative. You evaluate, infer, and speculate, piecing together implications while simultaneously imagining alternatives and exploring what-if scenarios. The story encourages this interplay, leaving gaps, suggestions, and understated signals that demand active participation. Reading becomes an exploration not just of what is written, but of what could be inferred, imagined, or intuited. The margins are as much a part of the narrative as the main text. They are spaces where thought, reflection, and perception converge to produce meaning. Spatial awareness is also heightened by the margins. You begin to see the text as a landscape, with central events forming a core path and peripheral cues defining boundaries, side trails, and hidden vistas. Your consciousness navigates this terrain, shifting focus between the foreground and the periphery, integrating subtle signals with explicit narrative events. The margins are not secondary, they are integral to the spatial and cognitive architecture of the story, providing depth and dimensionality to your engagement. Time, too, is affected by these peripheral spaces. Marginal notes, anticipatory hints, and reflective cues create a sense of temporal elasticity. Events are not strictly linear, earlier motifs resurface with altered significance, and upcoming developments are foreshadowed in delicate, understated ways. You experience a narrative temporality that folds inward and outward, where past, present, and future are interwoven in a dynamic, observer-dependent structure. Your attention to the margins facilitates this temporal awareness, allowing you to perceive the story as a living continuum rather than a fixed sequence. The margins of existence also prompt existential reflection. You sense that your presence within the story is not passive. As you scan the spaces between lines, interpret subtle cues, and anticipate hidden connections, you realize that your consciousness is entwined with the narrative itself. Reading becomes an act of co-creation. Your attention, interpretation, and reflection populate the margins with meaning, completing what the story begins. The text, the reader, and the story's latent potential merge into a singular experience, where awareness defines existence. Philosophically, these margins challenge the distinction between observer and narrative. By inhabiting these peripheral spaces, you recognize that reality, as presented within the story, is contingent upon attention and engagement. Every act of noticing, every inference drawn from the margins, contributes to the construction of the story's world. The margins are a testament to the participatory nature of consciousness, meaning is not fully inscribed but emerges in the interplay between text and awareness. Ultimately, the margins of existence transform reading into an expansive, layered experience. You are not merely following the plot or observing characters. You are navigating spaces where the story lingers, where possibilities and nuances converge, and where consciousness itself leaves an imprint. These peripheries reveal that narrative life extends beyond the central text, and that engagement with the margins is essential for a full understanding of the recursive, reflective, and living nature of the story. In these spaces, the boundaries between reader, narrative, and thought dissolve, creating a field where consciousness and story are inseparably intertwined, each giving meaning to the other. As you continue to navigate the text, a subtle yet profound awareness begins to take hold. The story is not merely a passive sequence of events waiting to be read, it is alive with memory, and it remembers you. Every choice of attention, every lingering thought, every reflection you have engaged in becomes part of an ongoing dialogue, a record inscribed in the narrative itself. You notice connections between passages you had previously skimmed and events that are yet to unfold. The story seems to respond to your cognition, echoing your reflections, highlighting patterns you have recognized, and drawing you into recursive loops that reinforce your presence within its structure. This remembering is not literal, of course. The text does not possess consciousness in a conventional sense. Yet the architecture of narrative, with its motifs, repetitions, thematic recurrences, and subtle foreshadowing, creates the effect of memory. Earlier passages resonate with new meaning as your understanding deepens, and previously unnoticed details gain significance. You begin to realize that your engagement leaves traces, not on the page in ink, but in the network of connections you have mentally established. The story is structured to reflect your cognitive patterns back to you, to mirror attention, expectation, and reflection in a manner that feels interactive. Emotion is central to this phenomenon. Moments of suspense, recognition, or revelation are amplified because the story recalls how you responded before. You experience a sense of déjà vu, a layered awareness in which memory, cognition, and narrative intertwine. The story's past sections seem to speak to you in your present reading, reinforcing the sensation that your engagement is not only noted, but incorporated into the ongoing experience. This recursive quality evokes both comfort and subtle unease. The comfort of recognition, the unease of being known by a structure that seems to anticipate your thoughts. Memory within the story functions both retrospectively and prospectively. You recognize echoes of your earlier reactions, but the narrative also lays implicit cues for future perception, anticipating how attention, curiosity, and emotion will unfold. Your engagement is mapped in a sense, and the story evolves in response to this mapping. The interplay between what you recall and what you expect creates a temporal layering that enriches comprehension. You are reading in the present, recalling the past, and anticipating the future simultaneously, and the story accommodates all three dimensions of experience. Cognition is likewise engaged in recursive loops. Each recognition, inference, and pattern discerned reinforces other connections. The story becomes a cognitive mirror, reflecting strategies of thought, interpretive choices, and attentional shifts. You notice your assumptions being challenged, your predictions being subtly redirected, and your focus being guided toward moments of significance. The narrative is both a stimulus and a responsive system, co-constructed through active attention. In this sense, reading becomes an act of co-creation, in which the story and consciousness are intertwined in a mutually influential loop. Spatial and structural perception is heightened. The story seems to fold over itself, linking sections and motifs across the text. Patterns that initially appeared linear now reveal themselves as networks, as webs of relational meaning. Your mind navigates these cognitive connections, tracing paths between distant chapters, cross-referencing recurring symbols, and integrating subtle narrative cues. The story remembers you precisely because your memory and attention create these networks, and the text echoes them, amplifying the experience of embeddedness within its unfolding. Time itself is pliable under this reflective engagement. Events and motifs recur not simply as narrative devices, but as instruments of interaction with memory. The story establishes continuity not only through plot, but through recognition, reflection, and the anticipation of understanding. Past, present, and future are not discrete. They exist as overlapping strata of engagement. Your consciousness experiences simultaneity, as the story appears to remember and respond to all layers of attention at once. The text becomes a temporal landscape in which you inhabit multiple moments simultaneously, each linked to your evolving awareness. Existential awareness emerges from this dynamic. The feeling that the story remembers you underscores the participatory nature of consciousness within narrative. You are not a passive recipient of events. You are an active contributor, your attention, memory, and interpretation embedded in the process of reading. The text and the mind are entwined, creating a feedback loop in which consciousness leaves a trace and the story responds in kind. There is a quiet, almost imperceptible intimacy in this interaction, a sense that the narrative is attuned to the rhythms of thought and reflection. Philosophically, the story's memory challenges traditional boundaries between observer and observed. It suggests that consciousness is relational, not solitary. That engagement with narrative creates mutual influence. Every recognition, every response, every attentive moment feeds back into the system, making the story simultaneously objective and personal. You realize that narrative is alive, not in a literal sense, but as a reflection of consciousness interacting with itself across structured text. The story remembers you because attention itself inscribes presence, and presence itself shapes the unfolding of meaning. Ultimately, the story's memory transforms the act of reading into a recursive, participatory experience. You move through text that responds to your cognition, reflects your memory, anticipates your perception, and resonates with your emotion. The narrative becomes both a mirror and a map, a landscape in which consciousness is embedded, tracing paths and leaving traces, always remembered in subtle, intricate ways. The story is alive within the folds of attention, and in its recollections you discover a reflection of yourself, continuously interacting with the world you inhabit within its pages. As you move deeper into the narrative, you notice a peculiar property of the text. The sentences themselves seem to mold the way you perceive, think, and feel. Each sentence is not merely a vessel of information or description. It is a sculpting force, shaping the contours of your consciousness as you read. The narrative syntax, rhythm, and emphasis guide attention, modulate anticipation, and even influence emotion. Words become tools of subtle architecture, bending your thought patterns in ways that are often imperceptible, but undeniably present. You are being formed, moment by moment, by the sentences themselves. This shaping occurs on multiple levels. On a literal level, sentence structure can direct the flow of attention. Long, winding sentences encourage immersion and reflection, whereas short, abrupt sentences demand alertness and provoke reaction. On a conceptual level, sentences carry implications, connotations, and resonances that extend beyond their immediate meaning. The words you read are intertwined with mental imagery, associative networks, and emotional responses, which together create a living, evolving experience. You realize that reading is a process not just of comprehension but of transformation, in which each sentence contributes to the shaping of your internal landscape. The cognitive effect is recursive. As a sentence unfolds, you anticipate its conclusion, relate it to previous ideas, and integrate it into your mental model of the story. Your expectations, shaped by prior sentences, inform the interpretation of each new line, which in turn reshapes subsequent attention. This ongoing feedback loop results in a layered, dynamic experience, where your consciousness is continuously molded by the interplay of syntax, semantics, and associative thought. The narrative guides you without overt direction, sculpting awareness subtly, like a hand guiding clay into form. Emotion is equally influenced. Sentences evoke tension, curiosity, or recognition, and the specific construction of words amplifies these responses. You notice that certain phrasings provoke lingering reflection, while others elicit rapid, anticipatory engagement. The structure of sentences can manipulate temporal perception, creating pauses, accelerating rhythm, or prolonging suspense. Your affective state becomes entwined with textual patterns, demonstrating that language is not merely symbolic but performative. It enacts a shaping of consciousness rather than simply representing it. Memory is interwoven with these shaping effects. Sentences act as anchors, connecting concepts, motifs, and reflections across the narrative. You recognize repeated structures, parallel phrasings, and thematic echoes, which serve to reinforce comprehension and recollection. By attending to these patterns, you begin to understand how the narrative designs interaction with memory itself, guiding retention and facilitating recursive engagement. Sentences shape not only present thought, but also future recollection, embedding themselves in the cognitive architecture of understanding. Spatial awareness within the narrative is also affected. Paragraphs and sentences form a topography of thought, peaks of intensity, valleys of reflection, and pathways of progression. The arrangement of sentences dictates movement through these cognitive terrains, subtly directing attention across the mental landscape of the story. You navigate not only the semantic content, but also the structural scaffolding that shapes perception, recognizing that each line functions as a contour in a complex map of thought and awareness. Time, as experienced in reading, is reshaped by sentences. The unfolding of clauses, the pacing of words, and the rhythm of phrases create temporal modulation, altering the perception of duration and progression. Anticipation, surprise, and recognition are orchestrated through the careful crafting of sentences, producing a sense of temporal elasticity. Reading becomes an embodied act of temporal navigation, where consciousness flows with the undulations imposed by textual structure, expanding and contracting according to the narrative's design. Existentially, sentences highlight the active role of consciousness in interpreting and embodying the narrative. You are not a passive recipient of text, rather your perception and cognition are molded by the interplay of syntax, semantics, and rhythm. Each sentence acts as a sculptor, and your mind is both medium and collaborator. This awareness brings a dual sensation, empowerment, in that attention and reflection amplify engagement, and humility, in that the narrative subtly shapes your mental and emotional responses without overt coercion. Philosophically, sentences that shape, illustrate the entwined nature of language and consciousness. Words are not neutral. They operate as instruments of cognition, affecting perception, thought, and memory. Reading is therefore a process of co-creation. The narrative guides and molds consciousness, while consciousness interprets, anticipates, and reflects. This dynamic highlights a reciprocal relationship between text and mind, revealing that comprehension is simultaneously an act of being and an act of formation. Ultimately, recognizing that sentences shape your consciousness transforms reading into a participatory, embodied experience. Each line is a deliberate, structured force, interacting with thought, memory, emotion, and perception. The narrative becomes a living environment, in which your awareness is continuously molded, your interpretations recursively refined, and your engagement co-creative. By noticing this shaping, you inhabit the story not as a passive observer, but as an active participant. A consciousness sculpted and informed by the language itself. The sentences are both guides and mirrors, shaping the mind that reads, reflecting the mind that engages, and producing an intricate, living interplay between text and thought. As you move deeper into the story, a peculiar awareness emerges. The author, once imagined as the orchestrator of every word, action, and pause, fades into irrelevance. The narrative no longer feels tethered to a singular consciousness guiding its course. Instead, it exists independently, a self-sustaining entity shaped as much by your attention, reflection, and interpretation as by any initial intention. The author, real or imagined, becomes peripheral, almost forgotten, as the story unfolds through the dynamic interplay between text and reader. You begin to sense that the narrative has agency of its own, an emergent quality arising from the reciprocal relationship between language and consciousness. This forgetting of the author is not literal. Rather, it is a shift in perspective. Where once you might have imagined a mind controlling every plot point, you now recognize that the story's life extends beyond origin. Characters, sentences, and motifs interact with one another and with you, forming a network of meaning that operates independently of authorial intent. The text functions as a self-organizing system. Threads weave, loops recur, and patterns emerge, all contingent upon the engagement of consciousness. Your focus is no longer on who created the narrative, but on how it exists and evolves in the moment of reading. Memory plays a crucial role in this process. Recollections of earlier passages, recognition of motifs, and reflection upon narrative echoes contribute to the emergent sense of independence. The author's presence is replaced by the living memory of the story, held and recalled through attentive engagement. Each instance of reflection reinforces the perception that the text is alive, that it evolves not through external dictation, but through recursive interaction with the reader's mind. The author is not absent. They have become invisible, subsumed by the narrative experience that you now co-create. Emotion is also transformed. You experience suspense, tension, and surprise, not as instruments wielded by a controlling hand, but as emergent effects of narrative architecture and your engagement. The story's capacity to affect you feels intrinsic, arising from the text's structure, rhythm, and motifs. The fading of the author amplifies a sense of intimacy and immersion. The narrative does not belong to someone else. It exists in concert with your perception, and your consciousness becomes a co-author in shaping experience, even if unconsciously. Cognition operates in tandem with this perception. Without an external author guiding interpretation, your mind navigates the unfolding text more freely, discerning patterns, inferring connections, and generating meaning in real time. You notice recursive loops, thematic resonances, and subtle shifts in tone, all of which create a rich cognitive tapestry. The narrative becomes a mirror of your thought processes, responsive to attention, curiosity, and reflection. Reading is no longer a passive act. It is an active co-creative endeavor, in which the text and mind exist in reciprocal relationship. Spatial awareness within the story is similarly affected. You perceive the narrative not as a linear sequence controlled by an external agent, but as a landscape shaped by engagement. Motifs reappear, sentences fold upon themselves, and thematic connections form pathways that your consciousness navigates. The author's absence allows you to explore the terrain of narrative with heightened perception, attuned to subtle cues, overlooked details, and emerging patterns. The story is a dynamic environment, continuously shaped and reshaped by attention and interpretation. Time is also reshaped in the absence of authorial guidance. Events unfold with fluidity, motifs recur with variable resonance, and past, present, and future merge into a layered experience. The forgetting of the author amplifies temporal elasticity. The narrative is no longer a fixed sequence dictated by intention, but a responsive continuum shaped by perception and reflection. You experience the story as a living temporal field, where anticipation, recollection, and present engagement are intertwined. Existential reflection deepens in this context. You realize that meaning is not imposed externally but emerges collaboratively between text and consciousness. The narrative's autonomy challenges traditional notions of creation, authorship, and control. You exist within the story not as a mere recipient of a predetermined design, but as an active participant, shaping and being shaped by the unfolding events. The story remembers, responds, and persists, independent of the original author, through the interaction of perception, memory, and reflection. Philosophically, this section underscores a central paradox of narrative and consciousness. The more the author is forgotten, the more present the narrative becomes. Meaning arises not from external intention, but from the interaction of structure, attention, and cognition. You recognize that reading is inherently participatory. The text is alive because you inhabit it, interpret it, and reflect upon it. The author, once central, has become an invisible architect whose work persists in emergent form, alive in the dialogue between story and mind. Ultimately, forgetting the author transforms the act of reading into an intimate, co-creative experience. The narrative exists as a living entity, shaped by words, motifs, and attention, and your consciousness is woven into its fabric. Suspense, reflection, and recognition are no longer imposed from outside. They arise organically from the interplay between text and awareness. The story, in remembering, unfolding, and evolving, becomes a mirror of your engagement, revealing that reading is not simply witnessing a narrative, it is participating in its continuous creation. The author may be forgotten, but the story thrives, alive in the spaces between words, in the folds of attention, and in the mind that reads. As you progress through the narrative, an awareness emerges that you are not merely reading a story, you are actively annotating it in ways both subtle and profound. Every thought, reflection, and emotional response becomes an implicit mark upon the text, an internal annotation that colors perception and interpretation. These annotations are invisible, etched not in ink, but in cognition, forming an intricate map of engagement. Each mental note contributes to a dynamic interplay between reader and narrative, revealing that reading is an act of self-expression as much as comprehension. You notice that certain passages provoke repeated attention, while others resonate only briefly before fading. These reactions act as markers, highlighting your interests, fears, curiosities, and assumptions. Your consciousness inscribes itself upon the story, layering meaning through reflection and recognition. In this process, the narrative becomes a living archive of self-observation, a canvas on which the patterns of attention and cognition are continually recorded. Every interpretation, whether conscious or fleeting, functions as an annotation of self, subtly shaping the ongoing experience of the text. Memory amplifies this effect. As motifs, phrases, and narrative loops recur, you recognize your prior responses and notice how they influence current perception. These self-annotations create continuity, linking past engagement with present interpretation. Your mind constructs a parallel map alongside the narrative, a personal guide that interweaves recollection, anticipation, and insight. In doing so, you transform reading into a recursive, participatory process, where consciousness actively contributes to the unfolding narrative, rather than passively observing it. Emotion plays a significant role in these annotations. Moments of tension, surprise, or recognition elicit distinct responses, reinforcing particular passages in memory and shaping subsequent attention. You may linger on a sentence that evokes unease, or return to a motif that inspires curiosity, embedding personal meaning within the story's structure. Over time, the narrative becomes inseparable from the trace of your emotional and cognitive engagement, each annotation of self shaping the reading experience while simultaneously being shaped by it. Cognition interacts with these annotations in complex ways. Each reflection, inference, and observation becomes part of a feedback loop that informs interpretation of future passages. Patterns you discern in early sections influence perception of subsequent text, creating an evolving dynamic interplay between attention and narrative. The story, in turn, responds to these internalized annotations, amplifying their relevance and resonance. You realize that reading is a form of co-authorship. Your thoughts and awareness are embedded in the story, shaping meaning as much as it shapes consciousness. Spatial and structural perception within the narrative is likewise affected. You begin to notice the interconnections between themes, motifs, and passages, as if the text is a landscape to be mapped through reflection. Your annotations of self guide attention across these cognitive terrains, highlighting significant areas, linking distant points, and creating pathways of understanding. The story unfolds in parallel with your internal commentary, producing a multi-layered experience that intertwines narrative progression with reflective engagement. Time is experienced differently under the influence of self-annotations. You may pause to reflect, revisit prior sections, or anticipate forthcoming passages, creating a sense of temporal layering. Past, present, and future converge within consciousness as you continuously map personal responses onto the narrative. This temporal fluidity enhances the recursive nature of reading, emphasizing that engagement is not linear, but an ongoing interplay between memory, attention, and projection. Existential awareness emerges as you recognize the significance of these internal annotations. Reading is not a passive reception of external material. It is an active dialogue in which the mind inscribes its presence upon the narrative. The story evolves alongside consciousness, and each mental note, each reflection, leaves an imprint on perception and interpretation. The self becomes both reader and co-creator, inhabiting the story while simultaneously shaping it. Philosophically, the concept of annotations of self underscores the co-constructive nature of experience. Meaning is generated collaboratively between narrative and consciousness. The text guides and structures perception, while attention, reflection, and memory contribute to the formation of meaning. The reader's mind is not separate from the narrative, but deeply entwined with it, creating a reciprocal dynamic in which self and story continuously inform one another. Ultimately, these annotations of self transform reading into an immersive, participatory act. Every thought, reflection, and emotional response contributes to the living fabric of the narrative. The story becomes both mirror and map, reflecting consciousness while simultaneously being shaped by it. Through this process, the act of reading transcends simple comprehension, revealing itself as an intimate dialogue between self and text, an ongoing conversation in which each mental annotation shapes perception, interpretation, and engagement. You are not merely reading the story, you are leaving traces of your mind upon it, embedding consciousness within the narrative itself. As you delve further into the story, an awareness surfaces. The narrative continues to exist and evolve independently of any single reading, memory, or attention. It persists, a living sequence of words, motifs, and structures, continuously unfolding, even when unobserved. This persistence is not merely a property of physical text or memory, it emerges from the interplay of patterns, meaning, and consciousness. You begin to sense that the story has a life of its own, flowing beyond your immediate perception, and yet intimately entwined with it. The narrative persists because it is more than words. It is a dynamic process, co-created by attention, reflection, and interpretation. Persistence manifests across multiple dimensions. On a structural level, the narrative maintains coherence and continuity. Recurring motifs, loops, and thematic echoes endure, creating a sense of order and continuity, even in the absence of direct observation. You notice that prior sections subtly inform the interpretation of subsequent ones, producing a network of meaning that transcends linear progression. The narrative's persistence is also temporal. Events, reflections, and interactions extend beyond immediate reading, influencing memory and future engagement. Each reading leaves an imprint, and the story retains its capacity to unfold and resonate, regardless of whether you are actively attending to it. Emotion reinforces this persistence. Moments of tension, surprise, or recognition continue to resonate even after attention shifts. You may recall a passage hours or days later and feel the lingering effect of its imagery, syntax, or thematic weight. The narrative, in this sense, maintains an existence within memory, operating as an enduring influence on thought, perception, and effect. This persistence challenges conventional assumptions about storytelling. The text is not a static object, but an active agent, capable of shaping consciousness across time and reflection. Cognition is equally implicated. As you read, the mind actively interprets, predicts, and reconstructs the narrative. This ongoing mental activity sustains the story, producing recursive loops in which comprehension feeds further engagement. You recognize patterns, infer relationships, and anticipate developments, generating a dynamic cognitive landscape. The narrative persists because these cognitive processes continually renew its relevance and presence. Even in moments of inattention, the brain maintains a latent map of narrative trajectories, motifs, and themes, ensuring that the story continues to influence perception and understanding. Spatial perception within the text contributes to its endurance. Sentences, paragraphs, and sections create a topography of attention and interpretation. You navigate this landscape, tracing motifs, revisiting concepts, and connecting distant narrative points. The persistence of the story is evident in the way these structures endure. They exist not only in text, but in cognitive maps, allowing engagement to continue even in your absence. The story's architecture supports sustained presence, enabling reflection, exploration, and re-engagement. Time as experienced through reading is both structured and elastic. The narrative persists because it is not bound to a single temporal frame. Recurring motifs, nested loops, and thematic parallels create a sense of continuity across past, present, and anticipated future. You realize that the story is simultaneously fixed and fluid. Its words are concrete, but their influence, connections, and resonance extend across the mind's temporal perception. This temporal persistence reinforces the feeling that the narrative exists beyond immediate observation, enduring as a layered, evolving presence. Existential reflection deepens as you consider the implications of this persistence. The narrative exists both independently and in conjunction with consciousness. It continues to unfold, to influence perception, and to resonate, regardless of direct engagement. This dual existence highlights a paradox. The story is neither entirely external nor entirely internal, but an interdependent phenomenon arising from interaction between text and mind. You begin to recognize that your engagement is both temporary and enduring. Your attention may come and go, but the narrative persists, continuously shaping and being shaped by consciousness. Philosophically, the persistence of the narrative illustrates the co-creative nature of meaning. The story's endurance does not rely solely on the author or the text, but on the ongoing interplay between language, cognition, and reflection. It emphasizes that meaning is not a static entity imposed from outside, but a dynamic process, sustained by recursive engagement. The narrative exists in its own right, yet its persistence is inseparable from the minds that read, interpret, and reflect upon it. Reading becomes an act of participation in an enduring process, one that extends beyond immediate comprehension and continues to resonate in thought and memory. Ultimately, recognizing that the narrative persists transforms the reading experience. The story is no longer confined to moments of attention or pages of text. It becomes a living process, co-created, self-sustaining, and continuously evolving. You perceive yourself as both participant and observer, immersed in a flow that exists beyond you yet through you. The narrative's endurance invites reflection, curiosity, and engagement, revealing that reading is not simply an act of reception but a dialogue with a persistent, living entity. Each moment of observation renews its existence, and each reflection extends its influence, ensuring that the story endures as a complex, evolving phenomenon in both text and consciousness. As you continue reading, a subtle awareness arises. The story you perceive may not be its only form. Hidden beneath the surface are revisions never seen, alterations, edits, and adjustments that exist in potential or in memory, but are never directly revealed. These unseen revisions create a layered reality within the narrative, a tension between what is presented and what could have been. Each sentence, paragraph, or motif carries the weight of possibilities, ghosted alternatives, that hover beyond conscious perception. The narrative you inhabit feels both complete and provisional, an ongoing experiment in structure, meaning, and attention. These revisions are not necessarily deliberate in an authorial sense. They emerge from the dynamics of reading itself. Your engagement, interpretation, and memory all create a spectrum of potential modifications. A sentence you reread, a motif you interpret differently, or a thematic connection you notice, transforms the story internally, producing an effect analogous to a hidden edit. The story is thus alive with unobserved adjustments, flowing between the explicit text and the implicit mental reconstructions that you generate. Each reading is a collaboration between the printed or imagined text and the interpretive mind, generating revisions invisible yet deeply influential. Memory functions as a critical instrument in perceiving these unseen revisions. Earlier sections of the text inform your understanding of current passages, and recollections of previous readings create alternate interpretations. These mental overlays act as provisional edits, shaping the narrative without altering its literal form. Your consciousness thus becomes an editor, revising and reconfiguring meaning even as the text remains static. The unseen revisions reside not in the physical page, but within this interplay of attention, reflection, and memory, existing in a liminal space between perception and potentiality. Emotion accentuates the effect. Moments of tension, ambiguity, or recognition often feel intensified by unseen revisions. A sentence that appears clear at first may reveal new layers upon rereading, influenced by memory and perspective. Each internal revision is accompanied by subtle shifts in effect, curiosity, uncertainty, surprise, or understanding, producing an experience that is both dynamic and deeply personal. You begin to recognize that the story is never fully finalized. It continues to evolve through the recursive interplay between your mind and the text. Cognition is central to this dynamic. You notice patterns, anticipate outcomes, and mentally rearrange events in ways that the text itself does not explicitly prescribe. These cognitive operations act as revisions never seen, invisible yet impactful. Each interpretive act modifies the flow of the narrative in your consciousness, producing a parallel story that exists only through engagement. The narrative's ability to persist and adapt relies on these cognitive contributions, highlighting the co-creative nature of reading. The unseen revisions, though intangible, shape perception, memory, and expectation, creating a fluid narrative that exists both on and beyond the page. Spatial awareness within the narrative is similarly affected. Motifs, sentences, and chapters function as nodes in a cognitive map, and your attention navigates these nodes, producing subtle adjustments and reinterpretations. Revisions never seen emerge as shifts in focus, connections drawn between distant motifs, and reinterpretations of thematic structures. The story thus occupies multiple dimensions simultaneously: its literal form, its remembered or imagined forms, and the potential forms that remain unseen but influence understanding. This multi-layered perception enriches engagement, allowing the narrative to adapt dynamically to consciousness. Time, too, is affected. The story is not constrained to linear progression. Past passages, current focus, and future anticipations interact continuously. Revisions never seen contribute to this temporal elasticity, producing variations in perception and expectation. You may recall prior sections differently after encountering later passages, and these retroactive adjustments generate a sense of narrative fluidity. The story exists in a state of continuous evolution, shaped by engagement, reflection, and mental reconstruction. Its form is both stable and malleable, an interplay between what is written and what is imagined, remembered, or inferred. Existential reflection deepens in response to this dynamic. The presence of unseen revisions challenges assumptions about fixed meaning, authorship, and narrative authority. You begin to perceive reading as a collaborative act in which consciousness participates actively, shaping the narrative even as it is shaped by it. The text's literal form is only one layer of experience. The unseen revisions are equally real in their impact on perception, memory, and thought. This duality underscores the interdependence of reader and story, revealing the multiplicity inherent in textual engagement. Philosophically, unseen revisions illuminate the fluidity of narrative reality. Meaning is not solely embedded in words or dictated by an author. It emerges dynamically through interaction with consciousness. The story exists simultaneously in multiple states, its literal form, its mental reconstructions, and its potential variations never fully realized. Each reading generates provisional edits, contributing to an evolving narrative that is both personal and universal. The text is not a static artifact but a living process, continuously reshaped by the interplay of attention, memory, and interpretation. Ultimately, recognizing the presence of revisions never seen transforms your engagement with the story. You read, not merely to observe, but to inhabit, reflect, and modify. Every interpretation, memory, and cognitive adjustment contributes to the narrative's evolution, making the reading experience dynamic, participatory, and profoundly personal. The story exists not only in words on a page, but in the continuous recursive act of reading, alive in thought, reflection, and unobserved possibilities. You are both witness and co-creator, shaping a narrative that persists, evolves, and adapts through the unseen revisions embedded in consciousness itself. As the narrative unfolds, a subtle transformation occurs. Chapters begin to whisper, not in audible words, but through suggestion, implication, and latent meaning. These whispers are the echoes of structure and rhythm, the hidden currents beneath the surface of text. You notice them in the cadence of sentences, the recurrence of motifs, and the patterns of narrative progression. They communicate without explicit statements, guiding attention and shaping interpretation in ways that feel intuitive rather than instructed. The chapters whisper because the story is not merely composed of events, but of resonances that permeate consciousness, subtle signals that influence perception without being overtly noticed. The whispering chapters operate on multiple levels simultaneously. On a structural level, they reflect patterns and rhythms embedded in the narrative. Repeated motifs, thematic parallels, and narrative loops produce an internal harmony, a hidden structure that resonates beneath conscious awareness. You may not consciously track these patterns, but their presence is felt in moments of recognition, curiosity, or anticipation. Each whisper functions as a nudge, drawing attention to significant passages, thematic connections, or emotional undertones. In this way, the story communicates not only through explicit content, but through the rhythm, flow, and internal architecture of its chapters. Emotion amplifies these whispers. Subtle shifts in tone, phrasing, or imagery evoke emotional responses that guide attention and influence interpretation. You feel the narrative more than you consciously notice it, responding to undercurrents that hint at meaning and resonance. These whispers create an intimate dialogue between reader and text, suggesting possibilities and pathways that may remain partially obscured. The story communicates in a language of subtle cues and effective resonance, inviting engagement not through direct instruction, but through perceptual and emotional guidance. Cognition plays a central role in decoding these whispered signals. Your mind interprets patterns, anticipates developments, and identifies thematic connections. Each recognition functions as a feedback loop. Whispers from the chapters elicit attention, which in turn shapes understanding and influences subsequent perception. This recursive interaction reinforces the narrative's impact, creating a multi-layered experience in which subtle cues, emotional resonance, and cognitive inference converge. The chapters whisper precisely because they rely on this dynamic interplay, a co-creative process between text and consciousness. Spatial perception within the narrative is subtly influenced. Chapters may lead your attention in certain directions, drawing focus to motifs, characters, or narrative arcs that would otherwise remain unnoticed. These whispered structures function as a navigational guide through the cognitive landscape of the story, highlighting connections, reinforcing patterns, and providing coherence across sections. You begin to recognize that reading is not merely linear, but topographical. Chapters create a map, and the whispers are markers that help orient attention, memory, and interpretation. Time itself is affected by these whispered chapters. Recurrent motifs and implied connections create a sense of temporal layering, in which past, present, and future converge. You experience the story not only as a sequence of events, but as an evolving temporal network, with each chapter's whisper echoing backward and forward, influencing perception of previous sections and anticipation of future developments. This temporal fluidity enhances the recursive nature of reading, emphasizing that the story exists as a living process within consciousness, unfolding across multiple temporal dimensions simultaneously. Existential reflection deepens as you consider the implications of these whispers. The narrative communicates beyond explicit words, suggesting that meaning is not entirely imposed by the text, nor entirely discovered by the reader, but co-created in the space between. Chapters whisper because consciousness interprets, anticipates, and reconstructs patterns that may never be explicitly articulated. The story is alive, not only in its explicit events, but in the subtleties of structure, rhythm, and implication that guide perception and thought. You realize that reading is not simply an act of reception, but a participatory engagement with a dynamic, responsive entity. Philosophically, these whispered chapters illustrate the subtlety of co-creation in narrative. The text contains cues, motifs, and patterns, but their significance emerges through interaction with consciousness. Meaning is not fixed. It is dynamic, responsive, and relational. You participate in an ongoing dialogue, interpreting whispers, responding to cues, and shaping understanding. This interaction reveals that reading is inherently recursive. Attention, memory, expectation, and interpretation continuously feed back into perception, producing an evolving narrative that exists simultaneously within text and mind. Ultimately, chapters that whisper transform the experience of reading. They remind you that narrative is not solely composed of explicit statements or plot points. It is also composed of subtle signals, resonances, and undercurrents that guide engagement. You begin to inhabit the story more fully, attuned to its quiet suggestions and responsive to the interplay of structure, emotion, and cognition. Reading becomes an active dialogue, a continuous negotiation between text and consciousness, where whispered chapters provide guidance, connection, and coherence. The story persists not only in words, but in the silent, evocative resonance that inhabits perception, memory, and thought. In this way, you become both participant and witness, engaged in a continuous unfolding process in which the narrative persists, evolves, and whispers to consciousness itself. As you approach the final paragraph of the narrative, a peculiar awareness arises. Endings are never truly endings. The last paragraph holds a unique power. It carries the weight of closure while simultaneously extending influence beyond its words. You sense that what is written here will linger, echoing through memory, interpretation, and imagination. It is simultaneously finite and infinite, defined by its placement at the conclusion yet unbound in its effect. The last paragraph does not merely conclude events. It shapes perception, anchors meaning, and suggests resonance that stretches beyond conscious observation. Within this final paragraph lies an intricate interplay between language and consciousness. Each sentence, phrase, and word is carefully positioned, not just to conclude the narrative, but to leave an imprint on thought. You notice the rhythm, cadence, and subtle repetition, designed to evoke recognition, reflection, or even tension. The last paragraph is a microcosm of the entire narrative, containing echoes of earlier motifs, refrains, and thematic threads. It functions as both closure and summation, a concentrated expression of the story's recursive patterns. Reading it is an act of engagement with the narrative's ultimate articulation, yet it is also a gateway to potential extensions and interpretations that exist beyond the page. Emotion is a vital instrument here. The final paragraph often evokes reflection, recognition, or a sense of completion. These emotional currents extend beyond immediate reading, resonating within memory and influencing subsequent thought. You may feel the weight of characters' journeys, the resolution of thematic tension, or the lingering uncertainty that the story leaves unresolved. The last paragraph is designed to provoke effective engagement, producing a subtle resonance that continues to shape perception even after reading ends. Its impact is both immediate and persistent, affecting consciousness in ways that are felt rather than fully understood. Cognition is equally involved. You mentally retrace narrative threads, recalling prior motifs, connections, and developments. The last paragraph often serves as a catalyst for this recursive cognition, encouraging reflection, pattern recognition, and synthesis. You perceive relationships between distant sections, anticipate unresolved threads, and infer possible interpretations. This cognitive engagement reinforces the narrative's persistence, ensuring that the story continues to unfold within consciousness even after direct reading ceases. The paragraph functions as both endpoint and springboard, simultaneously concluding events and enabling the mind to explore extensions, implications, and reverberations. Spatial awareness within the narrative is subtly affected as well. The last paragraph anchors the reader within the textual landscape, serving as a final reference point in a complex topography of sentences, sections, and motifs. It consolidates understanding of the story's structure while leaving room for mental navigation beyond its bounds. The narrative's architecture is completed in miniature here, demonstrating coherence and pattern while permitting interpretive freedom. You notice how attention naturally returns to recurring themes, motifs, or ideas, guided by subtle cues embedded within this closing segment. Time, as experienced through reading, is simultaneously linear and elastic in the last paragraph. Events reach their narrative conclusion, yet thematic and cognitive threads extend into memory, anticipation, and reflection. You may find yourself recalling earlier passages differently, perceiving motifs anew, or imagining alternative trajectories. The paragraph embodies temporal layering. It concludes the story's present, resonates with its past, and anticipates its ongoing presence in thought. The narrative does not end, it merely transitions, allowing consciousness to continue exploring, interpreting, and engaging with its structure. Existential reflection deepens. The last paragraph demonstrates the duality of narrative existence. It is both a fixed artifact on the page and a fluid, evolving influence within consciousness. You realize that reading is not merely absorption but participation. The final paragraph's resonance emerges from the interplay between text, attention, and memory. Its words persist, not only in physical form, but in mental and emotional landscapes, shaping thought and perception. You understand that endings are provisional, maintained and extended by consciousness itself, giving the story a life beyond its literal conclusion. Philosophically, the last paragraph embodies the co-creative nature of meaning. The text provides structure, phrasing, and imagery, but its influence relies on cognitive, emotional, and reflective engagement. Closure is therefore collaborative. The reader completes the narrative, internalizes its motifs, and carries its echoes forward. The last paragraph's power is its duality. It resolves and it extends, it concludes, and it initiates reflection. It embodies finality, while facilitating infinite interpretation. This is the nature of reading as a participatory process, where text and consciousness continuously interact to create enduring meaning. Ultimately, the last paragraph transforms reading into an act of meditation and reflection. It emphasizes that stories are not merely sequences of events, but dynamic processes that persist, evolve, and resonate within consciousness. You recognize your own participation. Each engagement, interpretation, and reflection contributes to the narrative's ongoing life. The story concludes in words, yet continues in thought, emotion, and memory. You are both observer and participant, witness and co-creator, inhabiting a final paragraph that is simultaneously the end and the beginning of infinite engagement. The narrative lingers, echoing beyond the page, leaving a trace of presence in your mind that cannot be erased. Even as the last paragraph fades, you sense that stories never truly end. They return, not in repetition, but in resonance, in echoes that ripple across memory, perception, and consciousness. A line recalled from an earlier chapter, a motif that reappears in thought, or a sentence whose meaning deepens over time. All these instances are forms of return. Stories persist because consciousness does not adhere strictly to linearity. It cycles, revisits, and reinvigorates experiences. Each act of remembering or reflecting is a rereading, a re-engagement with the narrative that allows it to return in transformed ways. The story becomes recursive, looping through thought, interpretation, and emotion, returning to influence even when you are not actively engaged with the text. These returns are often subtle. A previously unnoticed connection emerges between sections. A character's action resonates differently in memory, or a sentence takes on new significance in light of later events. Your mind continuously reconstructs and reinterprets the narrative, producing layers of meaning that were not apparent in the first reading. Stories return because consciousness seeks coherence, patterns, and continuity, drawing threads together to form an evolving tapestry of understanding. Even moments that felt ephemeral now reappear as enduring impressions, guiding reflection and shaping perception. Emotion amplifies the recurrence of stories. Feelings elicited during reading, curiosity, tension, nostalgia, surprise, linger beyond immediate engagement. When the narrative returns in thought, these emotions resurface, often reshaped by context, memory, and reflection. A subtle shift in perspective may transform a fleeting moment into profound insight or a minor event into a critical motif. The story's influence is thus perpetuated, returning in altered form to shape cognition, affect, and imagination. The narrative lives, not only in text, but in the emotional echoes it produces. Cognitive processes drive the return of stories as well. You anticipate patterns, predict outcomes, and reconcile contradictions, generating mental iterations of the narrative that do not exist physically. Each act of reflection reconstructs the story in a unique way, producing alternate versions that coexist in consciousness. These cognitive replays allow themes, motifs, and structures to re-emerge, sometimes in altered forms, sometimes emphasizing previously overlooked nuances. The story's return is a testament to the participatory nature of reading. It exists both in written form and in the ongoing activity of the mind, cycling through interpretation, memory, and anticipation. Spatial and temporal perception within the narrative contributes to these returns. You navigate the story's structure mentally, revisiting sections, comparing distant passages, and tracing the evolution of characters and themes. The narrative returns because you move through these cognitive spaces repeatedly, reconstructing connections and generating continuity. Time becomes cyclical. as past, present, and projected futures interact, reinforcing the story's persistence. Each return reshapes understanding, reinforcing the idea that narrative is not static but dynamic, continually revived through consciousness. Existential reflection deepens as the story's returns manifest. The persistence of narrative beyond its literal conclusion suggests that meaning is not fixed but fluid, emerging from ongoing engagement between text and consciousness. You realize that reading is a continuous process, endings are provisional, and every reflection or recollection constitutes a re-entry into the narrative. Stories return not because the text changes, but because your perception and understanding evolve, generating new interactions with the same material. Consciousness is both the medium and the participant in these returns, ensuring that the narrative remains alive. Philosophically, stories that return reveal the nature of experience itself. Memory, reflection, and interpretation act as mechanisms for recursive engagement, demonstrating that meaning is co-created and dynamic. The narrative is not confined to its written form. It is perpetually reconstituted through interaction with consciousness. Each return is unique, shaped by context, attention, and thought, ensuring that the story persists as a living entity within perception. You understand that your engagement is both finite and infinite. You read, reflect, and remember, yet the narrative continually returns, transforming with each iteration. Ultimately, the return of stories emphasizes the inseparability of narrative and consciousness. Reading is an active, recursive process. The text initiates engagement, consciousness reshapes it, and the narrative returns to influence thought, perception, and emotion. You inhabit a story that evolves, re-emerges, and persists, never fully concluded, yet continuously coherent. These returns reveal the story's enduring presence, a testament to the participatory nature of meaning-making. The narrative's life extends beyond words, looping through memory, reflection, and imagination. You realize that you are not merely a reader, you are a participant in a continuum of return, where the story lives, evolves, and resonates within you indefinitely. As you close the book, or perhaps never truly close it, you recognize that the narrative has not ended. It lingers, a persistent presence within your consciousness, a dynamic interplay between text, thought, and perception. Every sentence you read, every chapter you navigated, has left an imprint, subtle yet undeniable, shaping the way you think, remember, and even imagine. You are no longer merely a reader, you are a participant, a co-creator in a story that extends beyond the page and into the very contours of your mind. The story lives in its words, yes, but even more so in the reverberations they produce within you. Throughout this journey, you have encountered loops, echoes, and recursive patterns that blur the boundary between narrative and self. The chapters whispered, the paragraphs folded inward, and the stories returned, not as literal repetitions, but as persistent impressions, resonances that guide your attention, emotion, and reflection. You have felt the subtle pull of motifs, the invisible hand of structure, and the quiet persistence of meaning, all operating beneath conscious awareness. Each interaction with the text has been both instruction and invitation, guiding your thoughts while leaving room for interpretation. This duality is the essence of your experience. To read is to inhabit, and to inhabit is to influence, remember, and evolve with the narrative. Time and space within this story have been fluid, stretching and folding in ways that mirror consciousness itself. Past events echo into present understanding, while future implications reach backward, reshaping perception. The narrative is not linear. It is a multi-dimensional tapestry in which chapters, paragraphs, and sentences interconnect, producing a living network of meaning. You have been both observer and observed, character and reader, guided by words yet simultaneously guiding their significance through reflection. The story has unfolded within you as much as on the page, a co-created reality that resists finality. In the end, the story demonstrates that meaning is not fixed but emergent, a product of continuous engagement between text and consciousness. You carry the narrative forward, long after the final paragraph, as memory recalls motifs, reflection revisits patterns, and imagination projects possibilities. This enduring presence is the essence of storytelling. It persists because consciousness allows it to persist. The text provides structure, the mind provides life, and together they generate an experience that is simultaneously finite and infinite, concrete and ephemeral, explicit and implied. Ultimately, you realize that every story you read or live is a reflection of this dynamic interplay. The boundaries between author, character, and reader dissolve. The narrative is no longer confined to ink on a page, but exists as a living dialogue within consciousness. You are part of this story, reading it, shaping it, and carrying it forward. And in that realization lies the profound truth of your journey. The story is never truly finished. For as long as you exist, it returns, unfolds, and persists within you. You are, in essence, the living continuation of every narrative you encounter.